By the middle of the 20th century, nearly 100 inscriptions had been discovered relating to ancient Nepal, although only a small fraction possessed real historical significance. These inscriptions were written according to two separate dating systems, forming two distinct chronological groups. Most had already been published through the efforts of pioneering scholars such as Bhagwan Lal Indraji, Cecil Bendol, Sylvain Lévy, and later R. Gonoli, whose comprehensive collection of Nepalese inscriptions in Gupta script became an essential foundation for modern research. More importantly, these inscriptions provided historians with the only dependable means of correcting the serious chronological errors preserved in the traditional chronicles. The first group of inscriptions contains dates ranging from Samvat 386 to 535 and belongs primarily to the period extending from Manadeva through Ganadeva. A second series begins with dates around Samvat 30 and continues to Samvat 172, recording the reigns of Narendradeva, Sivadeva II, Jayadeva II, and their successors, together with several inscriptions issued by Amsuvarman himself. These two chronological systems form the backbone of early Nepalese history, allowing historians to reconstruct the succession of rulers with far greater certainty than was ever possible through the chronicles alone. The inscriptions also reveal important features of the administrative practices of early Nepal. Their script belongs to the Gupta tradition used throughout northern India during the 4th and 5th centuries. Dates normally record only the year, month, fortnight, and lunar day, while a few additionally include astronomical details such as constellations, yoga, and the auspicious moment of issuance. Curiously, none of these early inscriptions mentions the day of the week, illustrating the distinctive conventions followed by Nepalese epigraphists during this period. For the centuries before the 5th century AD, historians were forced to rely almost entirely upon the uncertain evidence of medieval chronicles. The discovery of these inscriptions dramatically changed that situation. Although they illuminate only about 3 centuries of Nepal's early past, they establish an authentic sequence of rulers while also providing valuable glimpses into the social, economic, religious, and cultural life of the Licchavi kingdom. In this sense, the inscriptions represent one of the greatest breakthroughs in the study of ancient Nepal. Another indispensable source for this period comes from the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, known in older scholarship as Huan-Tsang. Leaving China in AD 629, he spent more than 15 years traveling across Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Although it remains uncertain whether he ever entered the Kathmandu Valley itself, his writings include a brief but enormously important reference to Nepal. There, he describes Amsuvarman as a ruler who had lived in the time just past, a remark that provides one of the firmest chronological anchors for dating Amsuvarman's reign. An earlier Chinese traveler, Faxian, journeyed through India between AD 399 and 414 and visited nearby Buddhist sites such as Lumbini and Kapilavastu. Yet he made no mention whatsoever of Nepal. Whether this silence reflects simple unfamiliarity with the Himalayan kingdom or merely the limitations of his itinerary remains uncertain. But the contrast with Xuanzang's account highlights how much more visible Nepal had become by the 7th century. The first series of inscriptions forms the principal evidence for reconstructing the period between Vyasadeva and Ganadeva. Among the most significant are the famous pillar inscription of Manadeva at Changunarayan, inscriptions issued by his queen Ksema Sundari. Additional records commissioned during his reign, 3 inscriptions of Vasantadeva, several documents associated with Ganadeva, and a number of inscriptions whose royal authors remain uncertain. Together, they preserve the earliest secure genealogy of the Licchavi Dynasty. The Changunarayan pillar inscription occupies a particularly important place within this collection. Dated to Samvat 386, it records the succession of Manadeva's ancestors, naming Vyasadeva, Shankaradeva, and Dharmadeva before Manadeva himself. Other inscriptions continue this genealogy through Vasantadeva and later rulers, demonstrating that the Licchavi dynasty possessed a far longer and more coherent royal succession than the medieval chronicles had suggested. Curiously, these earliest inscriptions never explicitly describe their rulers as members of the Licchavi Dynasty. The first document to employ the title Licchavi Kulaketu belongs instead to the reign of Sivadeva. Historians therefore establish the Licchavi ancestry of the earlier kings not from their own inscriptions, but by comparing them with the genealogy preserved in the later inscription of Jayadeva II, which traces their descent from the legendary founder Supuspa of the solar lineage. The central chronological question then becomes the identity of Manadeva. Scholars have long debated whether the Manadeva mentioned in the Sumati Tantra should be identified with the ruler commemorated in the Changunarayan inscription. Because another supposed Manadeva has proved to result from an incorrect reading of an inscription, much of the earlier confusion has disappeared. The real controversy instead concerns the precise date of the Manadeva whose reign is recorded in the earliest epigraphic evidence. The disagreement stems from competing interpretations of the chronological era used in the inscriptions. Some scholars argued that the dates follow the Gupta era, beginning in AD 320, while others proposed the Licchavi era, beginning in AD 110, the Shaka era, beginning in AD 78, or even the Vikrama era, beginning in 57 BC. Each interpretation radically alters the position of Manadeva within Nepalese history. If the Gupta era were correct, Manadeva would belong to the 7th century, whereas other systems place him in the 5th century or even earlier. Resolving this question is therefore essential for reconstructing the entire chronology of the Licchavi dynasty. Closer examination of the inscriptions themselves strongly favors an earlier date. Their language, orthography, and style closely resemble the Gupta script of the 4th and 5th centuries rather than the forms used during Amsuvaman's time. Even scholars who disagreed about chronology acknowledge that the epigraphy of Manadeva's inscriptions differs noticeably from the script employed in the 7th century. Such evidence makes it difficult to place these documents as late as some earlier historians proposed. Another argument concerns Manadeva's royal title. Some earlier interpretations viewed his use of the relatively modest designation Nuripati as evidence that he ruled merely as a subordinate under the Thakuris. Yet, this reasoning proves unconvincing. The title Nuripati carried considerable royal prestige in early India and was employed by fully independent monarchs elsewhere, including Gupta rulers. Its appearance therefore offers no proof that Manadeva lacked sovereignty or occupied an inferior political position. Perhaps the most revealing clue lies in the complete absence of any reference to Managriha, the royal palace that appears prominently in later Licchavi inscriptions. If Manadeva had truly belonged to the early 8th century, when Managriha unquestionably served as the royal residence, its omission would be almost impossible to explain. The far simpler conclusion is that the palace did not yet exist when these inscriptions were carved. This suggests that Manadeva belonged to an earlier generation and may indeed have been the first great monarch of the Licchavi dynasty, ruling during the 5th century rather than the 7th. One of the greatest sources of disagreement among historians has been a single expression found in the inscription of Jayadeva II. The Sanskrit compound asyantare, meaning in the interval, has been interpreted in radically different ways, producing entirely different chronologies for the early Licchavi kings. Some scholars argued that it referred to the period during which the Thakuris ruled, placing the earlier Licchavi kings alongside or immediately before Narendra Deva's successors. Yet such an interpretation creates numerous historical contradictions. If the inscription truly intended to make Virsadeva and his descendants contemporaries of Narendra Deva, several important facts become impossible to explain. Chinese historical records, for example, make no mention of another Licchavi king ruling alongside Narendra Deva, nor do the inscriptions celebrate Dharmadeva as the conqueror of Tibet, despite later attempts to associate him with Nepal's victory over Tibetan forces in the early 8th century. On the contrary, the earliest inscription portrays Dharmadeva as a ruler who himself suffered defeat in battle, making the proposed identification highly improbable. Equally difficult is the complete omission of Amsuvaman from Jayadeva II's genealogy. If Jayadeva truly belonged to the Thakuri dynasty established by Amsuvaman, it would be extraordinary for the dynasty's greatest ruler and founder to disappear entirely from the royal genealogy, while earlier, Licchavi kings occupied places of honor. Such silence strongly suggests that Jayadeva II regarded himself not as a Thakuri descendant, but as a member of the Licchavi royal house. The inscriptions themselves reinforce this conclusion. Narendra Deva is explicitly described as an illustrious member of the Licchavi lineage, while references to the royal residence indicate that the old palace at Kailashakuta had already ceased to function as the principal seat of power. These changes appear to reflect a major political transition, perhaps connected with the period of Tibetan influence over Nepal during the 7th century, rather than the continuation of a Thakuri dynasty. Nor is there any convincing reason to believe that later rulers deliberately claimed Licchavi ancestry merely to enhance their prestige. By this time, the Licchavis had long since declined elsewhere in northern India, while the name of Amsuvarman carried immense honor in its own right. Any descendant of Amsuvarman would have gained prestige by celebrating that connection rather than concealing it. The genealogy preserved by Jayadeva II therefore makes far more sense if it genuinely records the succession of the Licchavi dynasty. Another interpretation of Asyantare proposes that the phrase refers not to simultaneous reigns, but to the interval separating Vasantadeva from Udayadeva. According to this reading, 12 rulers intervened between them. Although the exact wording of the damaged inscription remains uncertain, most modern readings favor an interpretation in which Udayadeva stands as the 13th successor within the second branch of the Licchavi dynasty, while Narendra Deva follows as his son and heir. This arrangement fits both the grammar of the inscription and the broader historical evidence more convincingly than earlier reconstructions. If this reconstruction is accepted, Udayadeva emerges not as a contemporary of Vyasadeva, but as a much later ruler. Several kings immediately preceding him, including Ganadeva and Sivadeva, were probably omitted from the genealogy because their political independence had been severely limited. Sivadeva I, in particular, ruled during the ascendancy of Amsuvarman and therefore exercised only restricted authority, which may explain why the inscription passed over his reign in silence. The Manjushri Mulakalpa paints a vivid picture of the troubled years that followed Vasantadeva. According to this tradition, Nepal entered a prolonged period of disorder marked by foreign domination and repeated political upheaval. The text speaks of outsiders and mlechas overrunning the country before stable government was eventually restored. Rather than describing several dynasties ruling simultaneously, the narrative presents these powers as successive rulers occupying the valley one after another. Within this interpretation, the reign traditionally assigned to Manadeva extended not merely through the lifetime of one king, but symbolically covered the broader era initiated by his dynasty. After the deaths of Manadeva and Vasantadeva, parts of the Kathmandu Valley appear to have fallen under the control of new tribal groups, often identified in later traditions with the Kiratas. Yet, the evidence remains uncertain. The Manjushri Mulakalpa simply describes these newcomers as mlechas, a term that could refer to various non-traditional or foreign peoples rather than a specific ethnic community. Despite these invasions, the Licchavis were not entirely expelled from Nepal. They appear to have retained authority over portions of the kingdom, while rival groups established control elsewhere. The political landscape therefore became fragmented rather than completely transformed. Several rulers, including Bakrama, Parakrama, Kamala, Bhagupta, and Batsaka, are presented as governing in succession over parts of Nepal until their authority was finally displaced by the rise of Amsuvarman. This reconstruction also explains the numerical sequence preserved in Jayadeva II's inscription. When the intervening rulers, together with Amsuvarman and Dhruvadeva, are taken into account, the genealogy corresponds remarkably well with the expected number of generations separating Vasantadeva from Udayadeva. In this framework, the Manadeva mentioned in the Sumati Tantra belongs not to the earlier celebrated monarch, but to one of the otherwise obscure rulers, omitted from the official genealogy, a king whose reign unfolded amid political instability and foreign encroachment. Numismatic evidence provides additional support for this chronology. The coinage traditionally known as Mananka, Gunanka, and Vatsanka combines artistic features borrowed from two great imperial traditions. On one hand, the seated deity and elephant motifs closely resemble those found on Kushan coins. On the other, the legends and inscriptions display unmistakable similarities to Gupta coinage. This remarkable synthesis reflects Nepal's position between two powerful cultural worlds while preserving its own distinctive identity. The Mananka coins are especially significant because they bear the epithet Sri Bhogini, an expression that corresponds closely with descriptions of Manadeva preserved in the Manjushri Mulakalpa. Earlier scholars mistakenly believed the inscription referred to Amsuvaman's sister and therefore attributed the coins to his reign. Later re-examination demonstrated that the inscription actually refers to the goddess represented on the coin itself. On that basis, leading numismatists identified the Mananka series with Manadeva I, the same Licchavi ruler commemorated in the famous Changunarayan inscription. The coins therefore provide independent archaeological confirmation for placing Manadeva among the earliest great monarchs of the Licchavi dynasty rather than in the later 7th century. Establishing the reign of Amsuvarman around AD 600, or perhaps slightly earlier, as suggested by one of his inscriptions, has important consequences for reconstructing the earlier Licchavi chronology. If this dating is accepted, the so-called Kirata revival must have taken place roughly a century and a half before his rise. That calculation places the final years of Vasantadeva in the early decades of the 6th century and moves the accession of Manadeva I back to approximately AD 460. This earlier chronology also agrees well with the artistic character of the coinage issued during his reign, whose style closely resembles contemporary Gupta prototypes. For this reason, Manadeva of the famous Changunarayan inscription cannot reasonably belong to the 7th century, as some earlier scholars proposed. Instead, he must be recognized as the first historically secure ruler bearing that name. The Manadeva mentioned in the Sumati Tantra belongs to a different generation altogether and probably occupied the throne only briefly during a period when powerful Gupta feudatories exercised considerable influence over Nepalese affairs. Distinguishing between these two rulers resolves one of the most persistent chronological problems in the early history of Nepal. This reconstruction also demonstrates that the continuity of the Licchavi dynasty remained remarkably strong. Even during periods of political crisis, the royal succession appears to have been interrupted for no more than 1 or 2 generations. Foreign domination and tribal incursions certainly weakened the kingdom, yet they never entirely extinguished Licchavi authority. Whenever rival groups gained control over portions of the country, members of the dynasty seem to have continued ruling elsewhere, preserving an unbroken royal tradition. In contrast, the excessively long genealogies presented by the medieval chronicles now appear largely legendary rather than historical. These conclusions naturally lead to another major question: the era employed in the earliest inscriptions. If Manadeva truly belonged to the Gupta age, the chronological system used in his inscriptions must begin sometime around the middle or latter part of the 1st century AD. Earlier attempts to identify the beginning of this era with AD 110, as proposed by Sylvain Lévy, brought the chronology much closer to reality than several competing theories, yet even this date appears somewhat too late when examined alongside newly available evidence. Additional evidence comes from the inscriptions of Sivadeva I and Dhruvadeva. When these documents are compared with the earlier records, they indicate that the starting point of the first inscriptional era must precede AD 110 by several decades. Later discoveries also undermine the traditional assumption that the second series of inscriptions began around AD 595. Instead, the evidence points toward an epoch closer to AD 570, requiring historians to move the beginning of the earlier era correspondingly farther back into the 1st century. The medieval chronicles further complicated the problem through repeated errors in their genealogies. Names were transferred from one dynasty to another. Rulers who governed simultaneously were arranged as if they had reigned consecutively, and carefully established chronological relationships were disrupted. Vasudeva and his immediate successors require substantial rearrangement, while Udayadeva should properly follow Amsuvarman instead of preceding him as the chronicles suggest. Several rulers, including Vasantadeva, appear twice under different circumstances, whereas the positions of Gunakamadeva, Sivadeva, Narendradeva, and other kings require systematic correction before the royal succession becomes historically coherent. One of the most important conclusions emerging from this reconstruction concerns the identity of Manadeva II. The Manadeva mentioned in the Sumati Tantra belongs not to the earliest Licchavi generation, but to the later sequence immediately preceding Sivadeva I. Once this distinction is recognized, many of the apparent contradictions between the inscriptions and the chronicles disappear, allowing the royal genealogy to be reconstructed with much greater confidence. The debate over the chronological era itself centered largely upon the work of Sylvain Lévy. He argued that the earliest inscriptions employed a Licchavi era beginning in AD 110, calculating this date by working backward from astronomical information preserved in the Changunarayan inscription. Yet Lévy himself acknowledged that his reconstruction failed to satisfy all of the astronomical evidence contained within the inscriptions. Even while defending his theory, he admitted that important discrepancies remained unresolved. Lévy based much of his argument upon the famous Changunarayan inscription of Manadeva. This record is dated to Samvat 386 and specifies the month of Jyeshtha, the bright fortnight, the first lunar day, the asterism Rohini, and the auspicious moment known as Abhijit. Earlier, scholars had attempted to identify this date by comparing it with several different chronological eras. Bhagwanlal Indraji considered both the Shaka and Vikrama systems before preferring the latter because it produced a more plausible average length for the intervening reigns. Later, J.F. Fleet reassigned the inscription to the Gupta era, calculating the date as AD 705 to 706 and asking the astronomer Shankar Balakrishna Dikshit to verify the astronomical details. Dikshit concluded that the lunar phases and constellations agreed closely with Fleet's proposed date, providing one of the principal arguments in favor of the Gupta era interpretation. The astronomical calculations surrounding the early Nepalese inscriptions have long attracted scholarly attention, yet they have never produced a universally accepted chronology. As one historian observed, the apparent scientific precision of astronomical arguments often proves deceptive. The positions of the moon, lunar mansions, and ritual time divisions recur frequently enough that they rarely identify a single unique date. Even when numerous astronomical details are recorded together, they may correspond to several different years, making them far less decisive than they first appear. This criticism was directed particularly at the chronology proposed by J.F. Fleet. His calculations successfully explained the astronomical details of the Changunarayan inscription, yet they conflicted with another inscription recording an intercalary month of Ashada. Under Fleet's system, the year in question should not have contained such an intercalation at all. The contradiction suggested that, however elegant the astronomical solution appeared, it could not accommodate all of the available inscriptional evidence simultaneously. Sylvain Lévy attempted to resolve this difficulty by analyzing another inscription from Kisipidi, whose reference to an intercalary month offered an important chronological clue. Because intercalary months followed predictable astronomical rules, they could potentially identify the correct historical year more accurately than ordinary lunar dates. Lévy carefully examined the Nepalese system of calendar calculation and concluded that it followed the average rather than the apparent motion of the sun and moon, a distinction essential for determining the proper sequence of leap months. Working from this evidence, Lévy compared the possible years in which an intercalary Ashada occurred. Of the several candidates available, only one fitted reasonably well with the reign of Sivadeva and the lifetime of Amsuvarman. This calculation led him once again to place the beginning of the Licchavi era in AD 110. Although he admitted that the origin of this era remained uncertain, he suggested that it might either have been brought from the Licchavis' original homeland in northern India or have commemorated some earlier political event connected with the expulsion of the Kiratas. Even so, Lévy presented his conclusion cautiously rather than dogmatically. He regarded it as only one possible solution among several. arguing that astronomical evidence should never be treated as the decisive foundation of historical chronology. Too many assumptions underlie such calculations, and slight differences in interpretation can produce entirely different results. Rather than relying upon astronomy alone, the chronology of early Nepal should be reconstructed through a broader combination of inscriptions, genealogies, and historical records. Following this principle, the genealogy preserved in the inscriptions provides a far firmer chronological framework. The inscription of Jayadeva II clearly demonstrates that the rulers commemorated in the earliest group of inscriptions preceded Narendra Deva by several generations. Since Chinese historical records securely place Narendra Deva in the middle of the 7th century, the earlier kings must necessarily belong to a considerably earlier age. The succession preserved in the inscriptions therefore begins with Vyasadeva, followed by Shankaradeva, Dharmadeva, Manadeva, Mahideva, and finally Vasantadeva. Once this sequence is accepted, Manadeva's famous inscription dated Samvat 386 can no longer belong to the 7th century. Even the most conservative calculation places him at least 3 or 4 generations before the reign of Narendra Deva, moving his lifetime back into the 5th century. Yet the available evidence suggests an even earlier chronological starting point. Newly examined inscriptions extend the first inscriptional series as far as Samvat 535, indicating that the chronological era itself must begin significantly earlier than many previous scholars had believed. The continuity of the first inscriptional series is particularly important. Documents issued under Ganadeva and Sivadeva continue the same numerical sequence without interruption, strongly implying that all these rulers employed a single chronological era. To suppose that different inscriptions within one continuous series suddenly adopted entirely separate eras would unnecessarily complicate the evidence and create new chronological difficulties where none are required. The simplest explanation is that the entire series belongs to one consistent dating system. A further problem concerned the inscriptions of Sivadeva I. Earlier scholarship had been confused because one important inscription was mistakenly read as containing the numeral 300 instead of 500. Later discoveries transformed the situation. Several additional inscriptions of Sivadeva, all preserving identical numerical symbols, demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that the correct reading was indeed 500. The repeated appearance of the same symbol in multiple inscriptions eliminated the possibility that the earlier reading had been correct. The historical position of Sivadeva provides another crucial chronological anchor. His inscriptions repeatedly mention Amsuvarman as his powerful feudatory, proving that both men lived during the same period. Since the lifetime of Amsuvarman can be dated with considerable confidence through the account of Xuanzang, the reign of Sivadeva must likewise belong to the closing years of the 6th century. At most, only a small margin of uncertainty remains regarding the precise overlap between their reigns. One inscription provides especially revealing evidence. A document dated Samvat 535 mentions the official Rajputra Vikramasena, whose name also appears in an inscription of Amsuvarman dated year 34. Because the same official occurs in both records, the two inscriptions almost certainly belong to the same general period. If Amsuvarman's year 34 corresponds to approximately AD 602 or 603, then Samvat 535 must likewise belong to that date, placing the beginning of the earlier inscriptional era around AD 68. This calculation revives the older hypothesis that the chronological system began sometime between AD 68 and AD 78. Under this interpretation, Sivadeva's reign naturally falls near the end of the 6th century, exactly where the Chinese sources require it. Any attempt to read the disputed inscription as containing the numeral 320 instead of 500 would shift Sivadeva's reign nearly 2 centuries earlier, making him impossible to reconcile with the securely dated career of Amsuvarman. Such a result would contradict not only the inscriptions themselves, but also every independent historical source relating to this period. Consequently, there is no convincing reason to assume that Sivadeva abandoned the chronological era used by his predecessors. The evidence overwhelmingly favors a single continuous dating system extending throughout the early Licchavi inscriptions. The debate over the chronology of Sivadeva I provides one of the strongest arguments against placing the beginning of the inscriptional era in AD 110. If Sivadeva's latest inscription is interpreted according to that system, his reign would extend to about AD 630 or even as late as AD 645. Such a conclusion immediately creates serious historical difficulties. Between the end of Sivadeva's reign and the restoration of full Licchavi authority, the inscriptions preserve the rule of several different political figures spanning nearly half a century. Since Chinese records indicate that Nepal had already restored the Licchavi dynasty by approximately AD 638, Sivadeva could not have continued ruling until the middle of the 7th century. His reign must therefore have ended considerably earlier, probably around AD 612 or 613. This calculation pushes the beginning of the inscriptional era back toward a date somewhere between AD 68 and AD 78, rather than AD 110. This conclusion naturally raises another possibility. Perhaps the inscriptions followed the Saka era of AD 78. The Saka calendar had already become widely used throughout both northern and southern India during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, while the Gupta era later existed alongside it. At first glance, therefore, identifying the Nepalese inscriptions with the Saka system appears entirely reasonable. Yet once again, the astronomical evidence creates difficulties. The intercalary months recorded in several inscriptions cannot easily be reconciled with the Saka calendar as traditionally understood. The criticism then shifts to the methods employed by earlier scholars. It is argued that previous chronological studies overlooked important principles preserved in Indian astronomical tradition, particularly the Bharadvaja system governing the insertion of intercalary months. According to this tradition, when the sun failed to enter a new zodiacal sign during certain parts of the year, an additional month of Ashada or Pausa was inserted according to carefully defined rules. Medieval authorities such as Narada, Bharadvaja, and later Jimutavahana all describe these principles in considerable detail. Unfortunately, even these alternative astronomical systems fail to resolve the chronological problem completely. Neither the Surya Siddhanta, the Arya Siddhanta, nor the Brahma Siddhanta consistently produces the required intercalary months for every inscription under discussion. Consequently, astronomy alone cannot provide a definitive answer regarding the epoch of the earliest Nepalese inscriptions. The problem ultimately exceeds the limits of historical interpretation and belongs more properly to specialists in ancient Indian astronomy. Until more conclusive evidence emerges, the safest provisional conclusion is to place the beginning of the era somewhere between AD 68 and AD 78. This uncertainty also casts doubt upon the existence of a distinct Licchavi era. Sylvain Lévy had popularized the idea that the Licchavis established their own chronological system, yet no independent evidence confirms that such an era ever existed. If the epoch falls near AD 78, it coincides so closely with the beginning of the Saka era that creating an entirely separate Licchavi calendar becomes difficult to justify. The simpler explanation is that the inscriptions employed the already established Shaka reckoning, although further investigation remains necessary to explain certain astronomical peculiarities preserved in the texts. Even if a specifically Licchavi era had existed, it would most likely have commemorated the conquest of the Kathmandu Valley and the defeat of the Kiratas, marking the establishment of Licchavi rule in Nepal. Yet the surviving historical evidence provides no convincing support for such a conclusion, nor does it justify calculating Manadeva's inscriptions according to a hypothetical Licchavi era beginning centuries before the Common Era. The available evidence instead favors a chronology tied more closely to the established historical eras of northern India. The discussion then turns away from chronology to one of the most important historical sources of the Licchavi age, the celebrated Changunarayan pillar inscription of King Manadeva. Like many royal inscriptions throughout South Asia, it opens with an elaborate invocation to Vishnu. The deity is praised as the eternal protector of the universe, whose divine power sustains the three worlds and whose glory is revered by the gods themselves. This sacred invocation establishes the religious framework within which the king's own achievements are presented. The inscription next introduces Manadeva's grandfather, King Vasudev. He is portrayed as an incomparable monarch whose greatness rested not only upon military power, but also upon integrity and moral discipline. His promises were faithfully fulfilled, his kingdom prospered under his rule, and he was surrounded by capable and well-behaved sons who reflected the virtues of their father. Through this description, the inscription presents the royal family as an ideal dynasty distinguished by both political authority and ethical excellence. Vasudeva's son, Shankaradeva, inherited a flourishing kingdom and continued the dynasty's reputation for military success and generosity. He is described as invincible in battle, sincere in character, liberal in spirit, and renowned for courage and prosperity. Under his leadership, the kingdom was governed through trusted officials who protected the land with strength and wisdom, ensuring both security and stability for the realm. The next ruler in the genealogy, Dharmadeva, is presented as the very embodiment of righteous kingship. Rather than merely obeying the law, he is portrayed as becoming the living expression of justice itself. Wisdom, moral conduct, and devotion to duty defined his reign, while his reputation enriched the tradition of ideal kings celebrated in earlier generations. According to the inscription, he was chosen by righteousness itself to inherit the throne and govern the kingdom with fairness and intelligence. Dharmadeva's queen, Rajavati, receives equally respectful treatment. Born into a noble family and blessed with wealth and virtue, she is compared to the goddess Lakshmi, the divine consort of Vishnu. When Dharmadeva died, however, her world collapsed. The inscription describes her overwhelming grief with remarkable emotional depth, portraying a queen whose devotion to her husband transcended ordinary human sorrow. From this royal couple was born Manadeva, whose birth is celebrated almost as a cosmic event. The inscription compares the young prince to the brilliant autumn moon, whose radiance refreshes the entire world. In him, the virtues accumulated through previous generations reach their fullest expression, preparing him to continue the greatness of the Licchavi Dynasty. Despite her overwhelming sorrow, Rajavati ultimately fulfilled the sacred funeral rites for her husband with unwavering dedication. She distributed her wealth among the Brahmins to increase the spiritual merit of the deceased king and devoted herself entirely to religious observances. The inscription likens her fidelity to that of the legendary Arundhati, the ideal wife in Indian tradition. At the same time, it praises Manadeva as a ruler of extraordinary compassion, describing him as patient, humble, beloved by his subjects, generous toward guests, and a steadfast protector of the poor, the afflicted, and the orphaned. These qualities, rather than military conquest alone, are presented as the true foundation of ideal kingship in early Licchavi Nepal. The Changunarayan inscription continues by presenting Manadeva as the ideal warrior king. His physical appearance is described in almost divine terms. His broad shoulders, graceful bearing, radiant complexion, and lotus-like eyes symbolize not merely personal beauty, but the royal virtues expected of a righteous ruler. His mastery of both offensive and defensive weapons reveals courage and discipline, while the inscription compares him to the god of love incarnate, emphasizing the harmony between physical perfection and moral excellence. Having inherited the kingdom from his father, Manadeva declares that he will honor his father's memory not through mourning or ascetic withdrawal, but through military achievement. He announces his intention to lead an eastern campaign, promising to defeat rebellious rulers while allowing those who voluntarily acknowledge his supremacy to retain their thrones as loyal vassal kings. In doing so, he presents conquest not as an act of destruction, but as a means of restoring political order under his authority. Before departing, Manadeva reassures his grieving mother. He insists that the highest tribute he can offer to his deceased father is to fulfill the duties of a kshatriya. Penance and religious austerities, however noble, cannot replace the responsibility of defending and expanding the kingdom entrusted to him. Rajavati, recognizing both her son's determination and his obligation to the dynasty, finally gives him her blessing. The campaign unfolded exactly as the young king had promised. Marching first toward the east, Manadeva compelled the rebellious princes of that region to submit. Those who had resisted were forced to bow before him, surrendering their royal insignia and acknowledging his supremacy. Without pausing after these victories, he immediately turned his attention toward the western frontier, determined to extend his authority even farther. Before beginning the western expedition, Manadeva issued instructions to his maternal uncle, ordering him to cross the powerful Gandaki River with the advance forces, while he himself followed with a larger army supported by horses and elephants. The description of the Gandaki emphasizes its dangerous whirlpools and swift currents, highlighting the logistical challenges faced by armies campaigning through the Himalayan region. The crossing itself became a symbolic demonstration of the king's determination to overcome both natural and political obstacles. The expedition ended in complete success. Manadeva captured the city of Mala and returned home victorious. Instead of celebrating solely through military display, he distributed immense wealth among the Brahmins as religious gifts. He also invited his mother to join him in making offerings, presenting the victory not simply as a personal triumph, but as an achievement dedicated to both his parents and the welfare of the kingdom. Taken together, these campaigns reveal the remarkable expansion of Licchavi power. Within only 3 generations, the dynasty had consolidated its authority throughout the Kathmandu Valley and much of the surrounding Himalayan region. Under Manadeva, this process accelerated as territories beyond the Gandaki River were brought under Nepalese control. The inscription portrays him not merely as a successful conqueror, but as the architect of a strong regional kingdom capable of projecting military power well beyond its traditional heartland. Some historians have attempted to identify the conquered city of Malapuri with the modern district of Gorakhpur. The geographical details contained in the inscription, however, make this identification doubtful. The turbulent character of the Gandaki River described in the text suggests a mountain river rather than the calmer waters flowing through the plains. Malapuri therefore more likely lay somewhere in the western Himalayan region, perhaps around modern Palpa, Puthan, or Dilek, where it may have served as a stronghold of the Mala people, themselves possibly connected with the Khasa tribes. The wider political significance of these victories has also attracted scholarly attention. It has been suggested that the Maukari rulers and the Lata Gupta king Jivitagupta I, both known to have campaigned in the Himalayan region during the early 6th century, may in fact have confronted the expanding kingdom established by Manadeva. If this interpretation is correct, the Licchavi kingdom had already become a major political power capable of influencing events far beyond the Kathmandu Valley, although its authority probably did not extend deep into the southern plains beyond the Terai. Queen Rajyavati emerges from these sources as one of the most influential women in early Nepalese history. Manadeva's devotion to his mother extended beyond the emotional scenes described in the Changunarayan inscription. He dedicated at least 2 temples containing images of Trivikrama Vishnu specifically to increase her religious merit. The inscriptions accompanying these monuments make it clear that the king regarded these foundations as acts of filial piety rather than merely royal patronage. His repeated dedication of victories and religious works to his mother suggests that Rajyavati exercised considerable influence over both his personal life and his reign. Manadeva's achievements were not limited to warfare. He also became one of the greatest builders and patrons of art in early Nepal. Numerous pillars, sculptures, and inscriptions commissioned during his reign survive as some of the earliest securely dated monuments in Nepalese history. These works provide historians with invaluable evidence for reconstructing the political, artistic, and religious development of the Licchavi kingdom. Under Manadeva, monumental inscriptions became a permanent feature of royal self-representation, celebrating victories while simultaneously preserving historical memory. Among these monuments, the Trivikrama Vishnu relief has generated considerable scholarly debate. One modern interpretation attempted to associate the image with the Kirata king Thunko and even linked it to Ashoka's pillar at Lumbini, arguing that the sculpture symbolized Nepalese resistance to Mauryan expansion. According to this theory, the dwarf incarnation of Vishnu represented the Kiratas, while accompanying imagery alluded to the destruction of Ashoka's pillar. He argues that the entire hypothesis rests upon unsupported speculation rather than historical evidence. Classical Indian literature consistently identifies Vamana simply as the dwarf incarnation of Vishnu and never associates him with the Kiratas as a distinct ethnic group. Likewise, there is no reliable evidence that the Kirata king Thunko was even a contemporary of Ashoka, much less that he destroyed the pillar at Lumbini. Such claims rely entirely upon imaginative reconstruction rather than inscriptional proof. Instead, the Trivikrama relief should be understood within the broader tradition of Indian religious art. Similar depictions appear elsewhere across the subcontinent, including scenes where horses accompany the Trivikrama narrative as part of the iconography associated with the Ashvamedha sacrifice. The Nepalese relief therefore represents nothing uniquely local or political. It depicts the familiar story of Vishnu's fifth incarnation, commissioned by Manadeva as an act of devotion dedicated to his mother, whom the inscription explicitly compares with the goddess Lakshmi. The temple itself was intended to honor Rajavati's memory and virtues, rather than commemorate any supposed victory of the Kiratas over Ashoka. By the closing years of his reign, Manadeva had assumed the full royal title of Maharaja, demonstrating the complete consolidation of his authority. Combined with his numerous dated inscriptions, monumental pillars, temples, and artistic commissions, this elevated title reflects his exceptional place in Nepalese history. His reputation rested not upon mythical associations with earlier Kirata rulers, but upon his own accomplishments as a conqueror, builder, patron of religion, and founder of the political greatness of the Licchavi Dynasty. The claim that Manadeva's inscriptions introduced a unique system of recording dates is not supported by the broader evidence of ancient Indian epigraphy. Long before the Licchavis, inscriptions issued by rulers such as Rudradaman, the Indo-Greeks, the Indo-Scythians, the Indo-Parthians, the Kushans, and later the Guptas regularly recorded not only the year, but also the month, fortnight, and exact lunar day. Although a few early inscriptions employed Greek or Macedonian month names, the overwhelming majority followed the same Indian calendrical practice seen in Nepal. Manadeva's inscriptions therefore continued an established tradition rather than introducing an entirely new chronological system. The same conclusion applies to their language and script. Both the orthography and linguistic forms found in the inscriptions of Manadeva and his successors closely resemble those of the Gupta period across northern India. Rather than representing an isolated Nepalese development, they form part of the wider cultural and administrative tradition that characterized the Gupta age. With the chronological questions largely resolved, beginning from an inscriptional era whose epoch lies somewhere between AD 68 and AD 78, Manadeva's first dated inscription falls between AD 454 and 464. By assigning an average reign of approximately 25 years to each predecessor, the genealogy can be reconstructed with reasonable consistency. According to this model, Vrasadeva, Shankaradeva, Dharmadeva, Manadeva, Mahideva, Vasantadeva, Ramadeva, Ganadeva, and Sivadeva form a continuous line of rulers extending from the late 4th century to the closing decades of the 6th century, while Udayadeva appears later as crown prince before the restored Licchavi monarchy of the 7th century. Within this reconstruction, the Manadeva mentioned in the Sumati Tantra finds a natural place between Ganadeva and Sivadeva I, rather than being identified with the famous Manadeva of the Changunarayan inscription. This distinction preserves the consistency of both the inscriptional and literary traditions while avoiding unnecessary chronological contradictions. The succession that emerges from this revised chronology differs noticeably from the genealogies preserved in the inscriptions alone. Several rulers known from independent inscriptions do not appear in the principal genealogical records, while Mahideva is included despite the absence of inscriptions issued in his own name. His reign seems to have lasted only a short time, perhaps no more than a year, suggesting that he ruled during a period of severe political instability. The rapid appearance of powerful Gupta officials immediately afterward hints that Mahideva may have been overthrown through their intervention. Evidence for the growing authority of the Gupta aristocracy appears in the inscriptions of Jisnugupta. There, Mahideva, Manadeva, Ganadeva, and even the Gupta noble Bhumagupta are commemorated together with equal honor. By placing his own grandfather alongside the Licchavi kings, Jisnugupta sought to portray the Gupta family as political equals of the ruling dynasty. During nearly half a century, influential Gupta personalities such as Ravi Gupta, Kramalila, and Bhumagupta exercised enormous authority within the Nepalese court, often overshadowing the monarch himself. The gradual rise of Gupta influence can be traced through the changing titles of royal officials. During the early reign of Vasantadeva, Gupta ministers appear merely as court functionaries. Soon afterward, however, Ravi Gupta is described as Sarvadandanayaka and Mahapratihara, titles suggesting the combined powers of commander-in-chief and chief minister. Another prominent noble, Kramalila, is even accorded the royal title of Maharaja, indicating that he possessed authority approaching that of the king himself. These developments suggest the emergence of a government in which powerful ministers increasingly dominated royal authority from behind the throne. As time passed, the balance shifted still further in favor of the Gupta ministers. Their inscriptions adopted increasingly elaborate honorific titles, while the kings themselves retained relatively modest designations. The contrast is striking. Whereas rulers such as Vasantadeva are praised in restrained terms, leading Gupta nobles receive grandiose descriptions emphasizing their divine favor, generosity, military power, and political authority. The changing language of the inscriptions reflects the gradual transformation of Nepalese government into one where the monarch remained on the throne while effective power accumulated in the hands of dominant aristocratic families. Following Ganadeva, the inscriptional record falls silent for roughly 2 decades. This absence does not necessarily indicate the establishment of a new dynasty. Instead, it may reflect a period of internal political conflict for which few inscriptions survive. When the records resume, Sivadeva I appears under the title Licchavi Kulaketu, the banner of the Licchavi family, issuing numerous decrees. Every one of these documents, however, prominently mentions the powerful Mahasamanta Amsuvarman, whose role becomes impossible to ignore. Although Sivadeva retained the formal dignity of kingship, his inscriptions devote far greater praise to Amsuvarman than to the sovereign himself. Sivadeva describes himself with only a handful of conventional royal epithets, while Amsuvarman receives lavish titles emphasizing his unmatched virtues, military glory, leadership among the feudatories, and supremacy over rival chiefs. In one inscription, he is even styled Maharajadiraja, a title traditionally reserved for emperors. Such language strongly suggests that, from the very beginning of Sivadeva's reign, real political authority rested with Amsuvarman, while the king served largely as the ceremonial head of state. The traditional Nepalese chronicles place the Gowala or Ahir dynasty at the very beginning of the country's history. However, that this arrangement is chronologically impossible. Since the Guptas did not emerge as a major political force until the 4th century AD, rulers bearing Gupta affiliations cannot reasonably be placed before the arrival of the Licchavis. Instead, the Gupta Ahir figures belong to the period following the reign of Manadeva, when the Manjushri Mulakalpa describes Nepal as passing through an era of political disorder dominated by influential Gupta nobles. Although some historians dismiss the Ahir dynasty as nothing more than a later invention, the available evidence points in another direction. References in the Manjushri Mulakalpa, together with several Nepalese inscriptions, confirm the presence of Gupta nobles in the Kathmandu Valley. What remains uncertain is whether these men ever occupied the throne themselves. Their political influence is undeniable, but their formal status as kings is far less certain. The relationship between these Nepalese Guptas and the imperial Gupta dynasty of northern India has also attracted considerable attention. Following the arguments of K.P. Jayaswal, they probably represented a collateral branch of the imperial Guptas. The Nepalese chronicles strengthen this interpretation by identifying them as Ahirs, a designation that also appears in connection with the imperial Guptas in Indian historical traditions. Additional confirmation comes from an inscription in which the mother of Bhaumagupta explicitly describes herself as Anahiri. Palmagupta himself later appears in the inscriptions of Ganadeva as Commander-in-Chief and Grand Chamberlain, leaving little doubt about the Ahir identity of this influential Gupta family. Numismatic evidence further supports this connection. The coinage issued by the Nepalese Guptas closely resembles that of their Indian counterparts, particularly through the prominent use of the Garuda emblem, one of the defining symbols of the imperial Gupta dynasty. Such similarities strongly suggest a shared political and cultural heritage rather than a merely coincidental resemblance. While J.F. Fleet dated the first appearance of this dynasty to approximately AD 407 or 408 by calculating from the Gupta era, places their rise somewhat later, in the middle decades of the 5th century. According to this reconstruction, Gupta nobles first emerge as prominent state officials during the reign of Vasantadeva and continue to dominate court politics throughout the next 3 generations of Licchavi rulers. Among these figures, Palmagupta occupies a particularly important place, identifies him with Bhugupta mentioned in the Manjushri Mulakalpa. In the inscriptions, he normally appears under the name Palmagupta, although his grandson Jisnugupta refers to him simply as Bhumi. He seems to have lived shortly before the rise of Amsuvarman, and according to later traditions, his descendants represented the final generation of the Ahir Gupta line. The chronicles even identify Matatirtha, northwest of Kathmandu, as the capital from which these Gupta nobles exercised their authority. The chronicles preserve a succession of leading Gupta personalities, beginning with Paramagupta, followed by Hasagupta, Manigupta, Vishnugupta, and finally Yaksagupta, who has also been identified with Jayagupta II. Paramagupta is equated with Parakrama of the Manjushri Mulakalpa and may also be identical with the powerful minister Kramalila. Later members of the family appear to have ruled or exercised influence in different regions, while repeated conflicts with the Licchavis gradually reduced their power. According to this reconstruction, the dynasty experienced a brief revival under Yaksagupta before finally disappearing from the political stage. Some historians have proposed that another branch of this Gupta family established itself in the Terai. Coins discovered in Champaran bearing the name Jayagupta II, together with a clay seal recovered at Nalanda, suggest the existence of such a branch. Although the evidence is insufficient to establish a direct connection with Jisnugupta, it remains possible that this collateral line survived in the plains until it was eventually replaced by another ruling family headed by Varasimha. These regional rulers may have continued as local feudatories until the complete consolidation of Amsuvarman's authority. Whether or not the Guptas formally occupied the throne considers them the true holders of political power for nearly 75 years. During the reigns of Vasantadeva, Ramadeva, and Ganadeva, leading Gupta nobles occupied essentially the same position later held by Amsuvarman and Jisnugupta. If the latter are recognized as de facto rulers despite not initially wearing the crown, the same judgment should also apply to Ravigupta, Kramalila, and Palmagupta. In effect, the Guptas governed Nepal from behind the throne, while the Licchavi kings retained the outward symbols of sovereignty. The discussion then shifts from politics to religion. The earliest surviving inscriptions reveal a Nepal in which the worship of Vishnu and Shiva already occupied a dominant place. Manadeva opens his famous Changunarayan inscription with an invocation to Vishnu and later commissioned a temple dedicated to Vishnu in his Trivikrama form. His queens also participated actively in religious patronage, erecting temples for Shiva and images dedicated to various Hindu deities. Other nobles and merchants likewise sponsored shrines to Shiva, Vishnu, and Surya, while one Gupta princess built a temple for Shiva. The inscriptions consistently emphasize devotion to the two great Hindu traditions of Shaivism and Vaishnavism. These records challenge the long-standing belief that the Licchavis entered Nepal as patrons of Buddhism. Instead, every available inscription from the early Licchavi period identifies the ruling dynasty as devoted followers of Shiva and Vishnu. Not a single contemporary inscription associates Manadeva or his immediate predecessors with Buddhist belief. Even the monastery later known as Manadeva Vihara probably dates from a later period and may have been connected with another ruler of the same name rather than the famous conqueror commemorated at Changunarayan. This does not necessarily mean that Buddhism disappeared from Nepal. It may well have remained popular among ordinary people while leaving few surviving inscriptions. The available evidence simply does not permit historians to determine its precise position during the earliest centuries of Nepalese history. The first unmistakable inscriptional reference to Buddhism appears only during the reign of Amsuvarman. An inscription dated to his 32nd regnal year records donations to several monasteries, indicating that by the early 7th century, both the Mahayana and Hinayana traditions had acquired substantial followings within Nepal. The history of Buddhism in early Nepal remains surrounded by uncertainty. No contemporary source records exactly when the religion first entered the Kathmandu Valley. By the 7th century, however, the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang clearly observed that Buddhism was flourishing there, making his account the earliest reliable external testimony for its widespread practice. Nepalese inscriptions from roughly the same period also confirm the existence of Buddhist institutions, but they reveal little about the religion's earlier development. Later, literary traditions attempt to push the origins of Buddhism in Nepal much further back. The Mulasarvastivada Vinaya preserves a story in which Ananda, one of the Buddha's closest disciples, visited the valley during the Buddha's own lifetime, implying that Buddhism reached Nepal almost immediately after its birth. Other traditions connect ancient stupas with the earlier Buddhas Kashyapa and Krakuchanda, while the 15th century Swayambhu Purana presents the primordial Buddha as manifesting in the valley long before the historical Buddha appeared. Although these narratives became influential in later religious literature, argues that they cannot be accepted as historical evidence without independent confirmation. The silence of the earliest inscriptions is therefore significant. Every available inscription from the early Licchavi period testifies to the strength of Brahmanical religion, particularly the worship of Shiva and Vishnu, yet none contains an explicit reference to Buddhism. This absence should not automatically be interpreted as proof that Buddhism was entirely absent from Nepal, but neither should later legends be used to fill the gap without supporting evidence. Insists that conclusions about the religious history of early Nepal must rest upon contemporary sources rather than retrospective tradition. With this discussion complete, the narrative turns to one of the most decisive figures in Nepalese history, Amsuvarman. The centuries preceding his reign can only be reconstructed through fragmentary inscriptions, conflicting chronicles, and traditions of uncertain reliability. Amsuvarman's lifetime, by contrast, rests upon far firmer foundations. His reign can be synchronized with the observations of Xuanzang, as well as numerous local inscriptions, making his chronology the central fixed point around which much of early Nepalese history must be arranged. The inscriptions reveal Amsuvarman first as the powerful Mahasamanta, or High Feudatory, serving alongside King Sivadeva I. Only toward the end of his career did his official position change into one resembling full royal authority. Yet many earlier historians dated these inscriptions according to the Harsha era beginning in AD 606 to 607, a conclusion that profoundly altered the chronology of Amsuvarman's life. Argues that this interpretation rests upon weak assumptions and ignores important historical evidence. Several arguments had traditionally been advanced in support of the Harsha era. Scholars pointed to the Nepalese chronicles, which claim that Vikramaditya conquered Nepal shortly before Amsuvarman established the Licchavi Dynasty, interpreting this story as an indirect reference to Harsha's conquest of the country. Other passages in the chronicles described a Vaisya Rajput lineage supposedly settled in Nepal by Harsha and connected Amsuvarman's title Panchalika with the Indian region of Panchala. Additional arguments relied upon Harsha's own Vaisya background. A passage in Bana's Harsha Charita interpreted as describing the conquest of Nepal, the assumption that Xuanzang's statement about Amsuvarman being deceased was based only on hearsay. Similarities in paleography, astronomical calculations involving intercalary months, and comparisons with the dating systems employed by later rulers such as Jayadeva II. Together, these points form the traditional case for identifying Amsuvarman's inscriptions with the Harsha era. Rejects each of these arguments in turn. First, there is no convincing evidence that either Vikramaditya or Harsha ever conquered Nepal. Harsha's documented campaigns did not extend beyond the region of modern Gorakhpur, and neither Harsha nor Amsuvarman refers to such a conquest in any contemporary inscription. Moreover, Harsha himself never adopted the title Vikramaditya, making the chronicle's identification historically implausible. The supposed settlement of Vaisya Rajputs in Nepal is likewise questioned, argues that the references to Panchala and Prayaga in the chronicles do not refer to the famous Indian regions at all, but to local Nepalese places bearing the same names. Panchala is identified with present-day Panauti, while Prayaga refers to a sacred locality near Godavari, southeast of Kathmandu. Consequently, the title Panchalika should be understood either as describing the inhabitants of Panauti or as referring to a local administrative body rather than indicating an origin in northern India. Nor does the available evidence support the idea that Amsuvarman belonged to Harsha's own Vaisya clan. Although later chroniclers described him as a Rajput, neither his inscriptions nor any reliable contemporary source associates him with Harsha's family. Likewise, the disputed passage in the Harsha Charita is better interpreted according to its literal meaning rather than as an allusion to the conquest of Nepal. Other scholars have even suggested that it refers instead to regions far to the northwest, making its connection with Nepal highly doubtful. Perhaps the strongest argument concerns the testimony of Xuanzang himself. Earlier, scholars attempted to dismiss his statement that Amsuvarman belonged to the recent past by claiming that he never visited Nepal and relied entirely on second-hand information. Finds this position unconvincing. Xuanzang's own writings indicate that Nepal was not among the countries he omitted from his travels, and his reputation as an exceptionally careful observer gives little reason to distrust his account. Even if portions of his information came from local informants, there is no evidence that he confused the chronology of such an important ruler. Xuanzang's testimony is reinforced by the Chinese Tang Annals. By AD 645, these official records identify the ruler of Nepal as a king whose name differs entirely from that of Amsuvarman. If Amsuvarman had still been alive, as required by the Harsha era chronology, the Chinese sources should have continued to mention him. Their silence instead confirms that another monarch had already succeeded him. For the same reason, attempts to identify Amsuvarman with Yasodharman of Malwa or to prolong his reign into the middle of the 7th century cannot be sustained. The combined evidence of Xuanzang, the Tang Chronicles, and the Nepalese inscriptions places Amsuvarman's career firmly in the years immediately preceding AD 637, rather than extending it to AD 645 or beyond. The traditional reliance on paleography as decisive chronological evidence is also questioned. The style of writing found in Nepalese inscriptions developed more conservatively than elsewhere in northern India, making direct comparisons unreliable. Even scholars who argued for close similarities with inscriptions of Yasodharman acknowledged that paleographic resemblance alone could not establish precise dates. In fact, the Nepalese inscription of Jisnugupta, discovered at Thangkot, provides stronger evidence than paleography itself, since it places his death before AD 639 and therefore supports an earlier chronology for the rulers associated with him. Astronomical calculations concerning the intercalary month of Pausa likewise require careful treatment. Earlier scholars relied upon the Brahma Siddhanta to identify the year corresponding to the Sundara inscription, but this method presents a serious chronological problem because the Brahma Siddhanta itself belongs to a period later than Amsuvarman. If the astronomical system had not yet come into use during his lifetime, its calculations cannot legitimately determine the dates of his inscriptions. Instead, the older Arya Siddhanta provides the more appropriate basis for interpretation. Under this system, the astronomical evidence no longer supports the chronology traditionally proposed by earlier historians. The discussion then turns to another influential theory advanced by Sylvain Lévy. Lévy proposed that the era used in Amsuvarman's inscriptions began in AD 595 and originated in Tibet. His argument rested upon two assumptions. First, that Tibet had conquered Nepal during Amsuvarman's lifetime, and second, that this conquest introduced a new Tibetan chronological era into Nepal. Subjects both claims to detailed criticism. According to Tibetan tradition, King Songtsen Gampo extended his authority over neighboring regions during the 7th century and received a Nepalese princess, Brikuti, in marriage. This alliance undoubtedly played a crucial role in transmitting Buddhism and Nepalese artistic traditions into Tibet. Nepalese monks, craftsmen, and religious teachers accompanied the princess, helping to shape the cultural and religious transformation of the Tibetan kingdom. These events are well attested in Tibetan historical tradition and remain among the most important episodes in the early relationship between the two Himalayan states. Yet cultural influence should not be confused with political conquest. Other contemporary sources tell a very different story from the Tibetan chronicles. Neither the Ladakh chronicles nor the official Tang histories describe Nepal as having been conquered by Tibet during Amsuvarman's reign. Xuanzang himself refers to Nepal as an independent kingdom, and the Tang records likewise state that before the reign of Narendra Deva, the kingdom acknowledged no foreign overlord. These sources collectively undermine the claim that Tibet exercised sovereignty over Nepal during this period. For this reason, Levi's identification of the Nepalese king mentioned in Tibetan sources with Amsuvarman cannot be sustained. The name recorded in the Tibetan chronicles does not necessarily correspond to Amsuvarman at all, and could equally refer to other Nepalese rulers whose names share similar meanings. More importantly, argues that reliable Chinese and Ladakhi historical records deserve greater confidence than legendary Tibetan traditions. Since these independent sources consistently portray Nepal as politically independent, the hypothesis of Tibetan overlordship during Amsuvarman's reign should be abandoned. The proposed Tibetan era of AD 595 is rejected on similar grounds. Levi's reconstruction depends upon a mistaken linguistic identification that falsely connected different chronological systems. Modern scholarship has shown that Tibet itself did not employ a continuous era beginning in AD 595. Instead, Tibetan chronology relied primarily upon cyclical dating for many centuries. Consequently, there is no historical basis for deriving Amsuvarman's inscriptions from a supposed Tibetan era, nor is there any evidence that Tibet introduced such a system into Nepal. Having rejected both the Harsha and Tibetan hypotheses, concludes that the era employed in Amsuvarman's inscriptions must have originated within Nepal itself. Given Amsuvarman's extraordinary political achievements, it is entirely plausible that he established a new chronological era to commemorate his own reign. Rather than deriving from foreign conquest or outside influence, the dating system should therefore be regarded as an expression of Nepal's own political independence during one of the most remarkable reigns in its early history. The remaining question concerns the exact year in which this era began. Earlier calculations connected the Sundara inscription with AD 629 because of its intercalary month, but the discovery of additional inscriptions has significantly altered the chronological picture. When Levi formulated his theory, the latest known inscription before Narendra Deva belonged to Samvat 49. Since then, however, the Sonagothi stone inscription of Visnugupta, dated Samvat 65, has been discovered. This document demonstrates that the Gupta regime survived considerably longer than previously believed and therefore forces historians to reconsider the entire chronology. Another inscription of Narendra Deva, dated Samvat 69, provides a crucial chronological anchor. The Tang annals report that the Chinese envoy Li Yi-piao visited Nepal while Narendra Deva was already ruling. Since the envoy's mission took place around AD 643, Narendra Deva's inscription must precede that date. Therefore places Samvat 69 approximately in AD 637 or 638, allowing a few years for Narendra Deva to consolidate his restored authority after regaining the throne. This calculation naturally shifts the beginning of Amsuvarman's era back to around AD 570. Astronomical evidence concerning the intercalary month of Pursa strengthens this revised chronology. Although several possible years contain such an intercalation under different astronomical systems, only AD 602 to 603 fits all the available historical evidence. If Samvat 34 corresponds to AD 602 to 603, Visnugupta's first dated inscription falls around AD 635 or 636, while Narendradeva's restoration naturally follows around AD 638. This sequence also explains why Xuanzang's account mentions Narendradeva but makes no reference to Jisnugupta. Had Jisnugupta still been alive, Xuanzang's informants would almost certainly have included such a powerful political figure in their description of Nepal. His omission therefore suggests that Jisnugupta had already died before Xuanzang gathered his information. After examining the available evidence, concludes that the beginning of Amsuvarman's era cannot reasonably be placed earlier than AD 568. If the epoch were pushed further back, the chronology of Amsuvarman's own career would become incompatible with the testimony of Xuanzang, while the reign of Narendradeva would also be displaced beyond the limits established by the Tang historical records. For these reasons, AD 568 appears to represent the earliest practical date for the establishment of the era, although emphasizes that this conclusion remains provisional and may require revision if additional inscriptions are discovered. Until more decisive evidence emerges, the epoch should be regarded as falling somewhere between AD 568 and AD 578. The purpose behind the creation of this era also deserves consideration. Some historians argued that it commemorated Amsuvarman's appointment as Mahasamanta, or High Feudatory, rejects this interpretation. The long absence of inscriptions from the supposed beginning of his career makes such an explanation improbable, and it would be difficult to imagine a ruler choosing to commemorate the relatively modest office of feudatory rather than the period of his greatest authority. A more convincing possibility is that the era began with Amsuvarman's birth, although this suggestion likewise remains speculative. The traditional chronologies that credit him with a reign of 42 or 43 years cannot be accepted uncritically, particularly because both the Manjushri Mulakalpa and several Nepalese chronicles describe the valley as still being under Gupta domination before his rise to power. His emergence therefore appears to have coincided with the restoration of Licchavi authority rather than with the period of Gupta supremacy. The surviving inscriptions of Amsuvarman provide the principal documentary foundation for reconstructing his reign. The earliest among them is the Harigaon Grant, discovered a short distance northeast of Kathmandu. Written in Sanskrit prose and engraved upon a stone slab, it opens with the formula Svasti Kailasakuta Bhavanat, indicating that the royal seat had shifted from Managriha to Kailasakuta. Amsuvarman still bears the title of Mahasamanta while presenting himself as a devoted servant of Pashupati and as a ruler concerned with the welfare of his subjects. The inscription records numerous grants made to temples, religious institutions, military officials, and palace personnel, revealing both the administrative complexity of the state and the close relationship between government and religion. It is dated Samvat 30, corresponding approximately to AD 598 to 608 under the proposed chronology. A second inscription from Harigaon, dated Samvat 32, takes the form of an official order addressed to the inhabitants of the village. They are instructed to provide specified donations for a variety of religious establishments. Particularly striking is the broad range of beneficiaries. Shaiva temples dedicated to Pashupati, Ramesvara, Manesvara, Dharmanesvara, Parvatesvara, and Kailasesvara receive support alongside Vaishnava shrines such as Dolasikarana Sayana and Buddhanilakantha. Buddhist monasteries, including Gum Vihara, Manavihara, Ravi Vihara, Karjurika Vihara, Madhyama Vihara, and Samanya Vihara, also receive financial assistance. The inscription therefore demonstrates that by Amsuvarman's reign, the state actively patronized several religious traditions simultaneously. At the same time, the absence of later Tantric Mahayana and Vajrayana deities suggests that these forms of Buddhism had not yet become prominent in Nepal. The document also records the existence of organized administrative committees responsible for managing these institutions. Another important record is the Sangha inscription of Samvat 34. Rather than celebrating military victories, it concerns taxation and local administration. The document grants certain fiscal concessions to village authorities in return for their contribution of oil to the government. It also identifies Rajaputra Vikramasena as the Dutaka, or royal commissioner, illustrating the continuing importance of provincial administration and delegated authority within Amsuvarman's government. A related inscription from Bungamati issues instructions for the protection of animals and fish, reflecting official concern with economic regulation and the management of natural resources. The Pasupati inscription marks a significant stage in Amsuvarman's political career. Here, he abandons the title Mahasamanta, retaining only the honorific Shri, a change interpreted as signaling his assumption of the position of regent or head of state. The inscription records grants made by members of his own family, including his sister and nephew, to Shaiva temples. It is dated Samvat 39 and also refers to Prince Udayadeva, whose precise dynastic affiliation remains debated among historians. The appearance of these family members demonstrates that Amsuvarman's authority had become firmly established within both the political and religious life of the kingdom. The narrative then introduces Xuanzang's famous description of Nepal, one of the most valuable contemporary accounts of the kingdom during the 7th century. He describes Nepal as a mountainous land rich in grain, fruit, flowers, copper, yaks, and exotic birds. Copper coins served as the principal medium of exchange, while the climate was cold and the terrain rugged. Xuanzang characterizes the inhabitants as highly skilled artisans despite judging them somewhat harshly in matters of social behavior and appearance. Most importantly, he reports that both Brahmanical and Buddhist communities flourished side by side. Approximately 2,000 monks belonging to both the Mahayana and Hinayana traditions lived in numerous monasteries, while the ruling king belonged to the Kshatriya caste and the Licchavi Dynasty. Xuanzang also praises Amsuvarman as a recently deceased ruler, distinguished by wisdom, learning, and authorship of a treatise on grammar, emphasizing that his reputation had spread far beyond Nepal itself. Xuanzang's testimony naturally raises the question of when Amsuvarman actually died. Since the Chinese pilgrim refers to him in the past tense while describing the reigning monarch as a Licchavi king, Amsuvarman must already have passed away before Xuanzang gathered his information. The precise year remains uncertain, but the evidence suggests that Druvadeva, following Sivadeva, had already succeeded to the throne by this time. Later inscriptions of Jisnugupta likewise refer to Amsuvarman as a ruler of the past, supporting the conclusion that his death occurred before the restoration of Narendra Deva, which cannot be placed later than AD 642 according to the Tang Chronicles. Some historians, particularly K.P. Jayaswal, attempted to place Amsuvarman's death in AD 639 by combining several groups of inscriptions with different chronological systems. Finds this reconstruction unsatisfactory. It would require Amsuvarman to be treated simultaneously as supreme ruler in his own inscriptions and merely as high feudatory in the inscriptions of Sivadeva issued during the same year. Such a contradiction is difficult to reconcile with the evidence of Amsuvarman's coinage and the changing titles employed in his own documents, which indicate that he had already abandoned the designation of Mahasamanta by Samvat 39. There is no convincing evidence that Nepal was politically divided between rival governments during this period, making such an interpretation highly improbable. The Thangkot inscription, often cited in discussions of Amsuvarman's chronology, is itself too uncertain to serve as a secure chronological anchor. Its date remains disputed, with different scholars reading the inscription as representing years ranging from 40 to 44. Moreover, the text records that the grant originated from Sri Amsuvarman, a wording that leaves open the possibility that the grant merely commemorated him after his death, rather than proving that he was still alive when the inscription was issued. Until both the reading of the date and the interpretation of the text are settled beyond doubt, argues that this inscription should not be used in determining the chronology of Amsuvarman's reign. The discussion then turns to the origin of the Thakuris. In later Nepalese usage, the title Thakuri came to designate Kshatriya families, traditionally believed to have migrated from the Rajput regions of northern India, distinguishing them from the Khasak Kshatriyas of the Himalayan hills. The related title Thakur, widely used in Rajasthan and also among certain Brahman communities in Bihar and Bengal, points to a common linguistic and cultural origin. The Nepalese chronicles employ the term in precisely this sense when describing Amsuvarman's ancestry, implying that his family had immigrated from the plains into Nepal. While no inscription confirms this tradition, notes that many ruling dynasties of early Nepal likewise claimed foreign origins, making such a possibility plausible even if it cannot be demonstrated conclusively. The precise lineage of Amsuvarman nevertheless remains uncertain. Brahmanical chronicles describe him as a Vaisya Rajput and have therefore been interpreted as connecting him with the dynasty of Harshavardhana. Yet the absence of the characteristic family designation Vardhana in his own name argues against such an identification. Others have suggested that he belonged to the Maukhari family because the rise of his ancestors in Nepal broadly coincided with the emergence of the Maukharis in northern India. However, regards both hypotheses as speculative and unsupported by direct inscriptional evidence. The evolution of Amsuvarman's political status can be followed through his inscriptions. Initially, he appears as Mahasamanta, the high feudatory serving under the Licchavi monarch. Over time, the language employed to describe him becomes increasingly respectful, and some historians have interpreted this as evidence that he ruled Western Nepal independently or even exercised authority equal to that of the king. Comparable titles are indeed known elsewhere in India, where powerful feudatories occasionally stood on nearly equal footing with their sovereigns. Warns that such comparisons may be misleading, since similar honorifics were often borne by officials whose actual constitutional position varied considerably. The inscriptions themselves indicate that Sivadeva I continued to be recognized as the legitimate Maharaja of Nepal, even while Amsuvarman accumulated extraordinary influence. In inscriptions dated as late as Samvat 520, Sivadeva respectfully addresses Amsuvarman as Mahasamanta, a title that still acknowledges the formal supremacy of the Licchavi king. Although Amsuvarman gradually ceased to mention the reigning monarch in documents issued under his own authority, and had begun using the honorific Shri by Samvat 30, these developments alone do not demonstrate complete independence. Much of his authority suggests stemmed from Sivadeva's own ascetic temperament and lack of interest in active government, allowing his powerful minister to dominate the administration without openly overthrowing the dynasty. The disappearance of the title Mahasamanta after Samvat 39 has often been interpreted as the moment when Amsuvarman became king. Considers another explanation more convincing. Rather than assuming full royal dignity, Amsuvarman may have become the effective head of state while deliberately avoiding the conventional royal title Pataraka Maharaja. His position resembled that of a regent, or perhaps even the head of a republican state, whose executive authority was absolute despite the continued existence of the Licchavi monarchy. He exercised unrestricted control over government, issued commands to subordinate feudatories, and even addressed future rulers directly in his official decrees, powers normally associated with kingship even if he refrained from explicitly claiming the royal title. The coinage issued during his administration adds another dimension to this debate. Some of Amsuvarman's coins bear only the title Shri, while others include the more exalted designation Maharajadiraja. At first sight, this appears to support the view that he eventually became king. Urges caution, however, because similar honorifics also appear on the coinage of regents in Nepal. The use of Maharajadiraja therefore need not imply formal accession to the throne. Instead, later references describing him by this title may simply represent posthumous courtesy or an acknowledgement of the extraordinary authority he exercised during his lifetime. In this interpretation, Amsuvarman remained constitutionally distinct from the Licchavi monarch, even while wielding powers comparable to those of a sovereign. A subtle but revealing feature of Amsuvarman's inscriptions further supports this conclusion. Nepalese kings traditionally instructed their successors to preserve their decrees as acts issued by previous rulers. Amsuvarman consistently avoids this conventional royal formula. Instead, he frames his orders in terms of obedience to respected teachers and the authority of religious duty. Even when employing language that resembles the traditional royal formula, he carefully modifies it to emphasize moral and religious obligation rather than dynastic sovereignty. Such wording suggests that he consciously distinguished his own position from that of hereditary kings. Although he governed with virtually unlimited executive authority, he appears to have accepted a constitutional role different from that of the monarch seated upon the Licchavi throne. Xuanzang's assessment of Amsuvarman stands out because of the Chinese pilgrim's reputation for careful and restrained judgment. He was not inclined to praise rulers without good reason, yet he describes Amsuvarman as a man distinguished by exceptional military ability, intellectual achievement, and personal wisdom. Therefore regards Xuanzang's testimony as one of the strongest independent confirmations of Amsuvarman's extraordinary stature among the rulers of his age. Amsuvarman's military career appears to have begun with campaigns against rebellious feudatory chiefs in eastern and southern Nepal. Like the contemporary Indian system, Nepalese feudalism rested upon the authority of powerful samantas, regional governors who exercised military and administrative control over their own territories while theoretically acknowledging the king's supremacy. Whenever the central government weakened, these local rulers frequently attempted to assert complete independence. The earlier domination of the valley by the Arya Guptas had developed in precisely this manner, and Amsuvarman himself first emerged within the same political environment before eventually transforming it through his own leadership. When Amsuvarman rose to prominence, Nepal faced one of the most difficult periods in its early history. King Sivadeva I lacked the qualities necessary to control the increasingly fragmented kingdom, while the Gupta regime still retained considerable influence. Independent principalities existed in both eastern and western Nepal, and the Manjushri Mulakalpa suggests that eastern Nepal remained under Mleccha rulers. The Terai, meanwhile, was controlled by a branch of the Gupta dynasty based at Simraungarh. Under these circumstances, the remaining territory loyal to the Licchavis seems to have been concentrated among the Thakuri lands, where Amsuvarman probably became the principal defender of the legitimate dynasty. The restoration of the Licchavis enjoyed broad popular support. Many people regarded the Gupta rulers as usurpers and continued to recognize the Licchavis as the lawful royal family of Nepal. Amsuvarman's military campaigns against the Guptas therefore represented more than a struggle for personal power. In this interpretation, they fulfilled a widespread desire to restore the traditional dynasty and reunify the kingdom under its legitimate rulers. Unfortunately, the surviving historical record preserves almost no detailed narrative of these campaigns. Neither Nepalese nor foreign sources describe the battles themselves, and Amsuvarman's inscriptions mention military victories only in broad and highly conventional language. Even so, the cumulative testimony of several inscriptions leaves little doubt that he achieved remarkable success in suppressing his enemies and consolidating his authority. One inscription of Sivadeva I records that Amsuvarman attained great glory through victories over hostile forces, although it does not identify those enemies by name. Another praises his overwhelming military strength and his ability to crush all opposition, while a third celebrates his courage in subduing his rivals. Together, these inscriptions suggest that the campaigns leading to the restoration of Licchavi authority were relatively swift and decisive. By the end of these conflicts, Amsuvarman had become not only the kingdom's dominant military commander, but also its most capable administrator. Significantly, he also became the first ruler in Nepalese history to issue coins bearing his own name, a powerful symbol of political authority. Although the inscriptions alone cannot conclusively prove the conquest of the Gupta Ahirs, they become far more persuasive when read alongside the Nepalese chronicles. While those chronicles often contain legendary or inaccurate material, they also preserve fragments of genuine historical memory. Their accounts of Amsuvarman's reputation and the decline of Gupta power correspond closely enough with the inscriptional evidence to suggest that they preserve at least the essential outline of actual events. The discussion then shifts to the geographical extent of Amsuvarman's kingdom. Some historians have minimized the size of early Nepal, arguing that it consisted only of the Kathmandu Valley and a few neighboring districts. Drawing upon genealogical traditions and later geographical works, he argues that Nepal generally extended between the Gandaki River in the west and the Dudh Kosi in the east. Although the precise frontiers changed according to political circumstances, these rivers formed the kingdom's natural boundaries throughout much of its early history. According to this reconstruction, Amsuvarman significantly expanded the kingdom by incorporating large portions of the Terai after defeating the Gupta rulers. Nepal's frontier may even have extended into the region of modern Betia, bringing it close to the domains of Emperor Harsha. Maintaining such an extensive frontier against one of northern India's most powerful rulers demonstrates the remarkable strength of Amsuvarman's government. At the same time, the Chinese historical sources indicate that he successfully preserved Nepal's independence in the face of growing Tibetan power. Even if occasional conflicts with Tibet occurred, neither the Tang Annals nor Xuanzang provides any evidence that Nepal ever accepted Tibetan overlordship during his reign. Instead, Amsuvarman emerges as a ruler who defended his kingdom's sovereignty against both southern and northern pressures. Military success, however, formed only one aspect of Amsuvarman's legacy. He also acquired an outstanding reputation as a scholar and patron of learning. One inscription praises his mastery of many branches of knowledge, while Xuanzang records that he composed an important treatise on grammar or linguistic science. Although the work itself has not survived, its existence demonstrates that Amsuvarman's interests extended far beyond warfare and politics. His court became an important intellectual center that attracted distinguished scholars, among them the celebrated grammarian Chandravarman, whose reputation extended to the famous University of Nalanda. Together, they promoted a more refined and standardized form of Sanskrit, replacing the less polished language that had previously characterized official inscriptions in Nepal. During Amsuvarman's reign, the literary quality of inscriptional Sanskrit improved noticeably, reflecting both his personal scholarship and his active encouragement of intellectual life. Even while carrying the burdens of government, he never neglected literary pursuits. Although Amsuvarman was personally a devoted follower of Shaivism, his reign was distinguished by an unusual degree of religious tolerance. Far from favoring only his own faith, he extended generous patronage to every major religious community in the kingdom, including Buddhist monasteries. His inscriptions show that donations to Buddhist institutions were no less substantial than those made to Shaiva temples, reflecting a deliberate policy of distributing royal support according to the needs of each religious establishment rather than according to sectarian preference. The titles and symbols employed by Amsuvarman further illustrate this balanced approach. His frequent invocation of Lord Pashupati and the appearance of Nandi, Shiva's sacred bull, on several inscriptions clearly identify him as a Shaivite. Yet these expressions of personal devotion are never accompanied by hostility toward other traditions. On the contrary, one of his inscriptions prominently displays the Buddhist symbol of the Wheel of the Law flanked by two deer, an image associated with the Buddha's first sermon. This policy represented a dramatic departure from the preceding Gupta administration. The Gupta rulers are portrayed as rigid adherents of orthodox Shaivism who appear to have restricted the freedom enjoyed by other religious communities. Such sectarian favoritism allegedly generated resentment throughout the kingdom and contributed to the downfall of their regime. Amsuvarman responded by restoring the traditional Licchavi policy of religious coexistence. Although he remained personally devoted to Shiva, he consciously embraced Buddhist institutions as well, promoting harmony among the diverse religious communities of Nepal and ensuring that monasteries, temples, and sacred images received equal protection under the law. The consequences of this policy were profound. An atmosphere of trust gradually developed between followers of different religions, allowing Hindu and Buddhist communities to flourish side by side. Xuanzang himself remarked upon the remarkable sight of Hindu temples standing immediately beside Buddhist monasteries, a physical expression of the religious coexistence that had become characteristic of Nepalese society. This enduring tradition of tolerance owes much to Amsuvarman's statesmanship, placing him alongside Emperor Ashoka as one of South Asia's great advocates of religious harmony. Even where the state exercised authority over religious institutions, its role remained limited. Royal intervention generally extended only to ensuring that grants and endowments were properly administered according to law. The actual management of temples and monasteries rested with autonomous committees known as panchalikas, whose independence from routine governmental interference was guaranteed. Each religious community maintained its own administrative organization, while the Buddhist monasteries were coordinated by a powerful bhiksu sangha, capable at times of issuing regulations and directives to monasteries throughout the kingdom. This arrangement demonstrates that Amsuvarman's government encouraged organized religious life while respecting the internal autonomy of each community. The narrative then shifts to the careers of Jisnugupta and his successor Visnugupta. Later, Nepalese chronicles omit Jisnugupta almost entirely, although earlier traditions recorded by Kirkpatrick place the Gupta family immediately after the Licchavis. Building upon the inscriptional evidence discussed earlier, identifies the Kisnugupta mentioned in the chronicles with the historical Jisnugupta and argues that both he and Visnugupta belong to the Gupta family rather than to either the Licchavi or Thakuri dynasties. An inscription in which Jisnugupta identifies Paumagupta as his grandfather confirms the revival of Gupta political influence during the early 7th century. Unlike Amsuvarman, whose inscriptions emphasize devotion to Pashupati, Jisnugupta consistently dedicated his religious acts to Vishnu, revealing him to have been a committed Vaishnavite. A substantial body of inscriptional evidence survives from Jisnugupta's administration. The Thankot inscription, discovered west of Kathmandu, records the remission of certain public dues and traces the ruler's ancestry to Managupta Gomin. It also describes Jisnugupta as a member of the Lunar dynasty while preserving many of the honorific expressions previously employed by Amsuvarman. Most importantly, it explicitly acknowledges the authority of the Licchavi king Bhimarjuna Deva, who occupied the throne at Managriha. Earlier, scholars mistakenly read the king's name as Manadeva and misunderstood the inscription's date, but the corrected reading substantially alters the political interpretation of the period. Other inscriptions reinforce this constitutional arrangement. The Patan Charter records repairs to a conduit originally constructed by Amsuvarman while naming Dhruvadeva as the reigning Licchavi king. Visnugupta, then still a crown prince, appears as the royal commissioner. Likewise, the Minanarayan inscription refers to Dhruvadeva and describes Jisnugupta as acting for the benefit of both the king and the people while repairing another irrigation canal first established during Amsuvarman's administration. Although historians have debated whether these references merely express courtesy or acknowledge genuine overlordship. Additional inscriptions illuminate Jisnugupta's independent authority. A Pasupati record documents grants for the repair of the temple of Chandasvara during his victorious reign without mentioning any Licchavi ruler. Another inscription from Maligaon, dated Samvat 59, preserves evidence of his own administration at Kailasakuta. His coinage, distinguished by a winged bull and an ornate trident, also reflects continuity with earlier Nepalese numismatic traditions while displaying distinctive artistic features. Two inscriptions of his son Visnugupta, dated Samvat 64 and 65, continue the same administrative style and are especially noteworthy because they contain one of the earliest known uses of the word Nepala to designate the kingdom. Addresses the political crisis that followed Amsuvarman's death. Earlier interpretations of the Thankot inscription suggested that Jisnugupta ruled under a king named Manadeva III. Because the reading of the inscription has now been corrected, this reconstruction is rejected. The ruler referred to is instead identified as Dhruvadeva, who is believed to have seized the throne during the turmoil that erupted around AD 617 or 618. Chinese sources report that Narendradeva's father was forced into exile in Tibet after losing the throne, and the inscriptional evidence appears to correspond closely with this account. Jisnugupta himself claims that his authority rested both upon popular support and the prestige of his distinguished ancestry, implying that succession during this turbulent period depended less upon hereditary right than upon political opportunity. While Udayadeva was attempting to secure support abroad, Jisnugupta was strengthening his authority within Nepal. Unlike Amsuvarman, who gradually accumulated power through recognized offices of state, Jisnugupta possessed no legitimate claim to the regency created by his predecessor. Instead, he exercised authority through a succession of Licchavi kings who remained on the throne only as nominal rulers, while real power rested entirely in his own hands. His inscriptions employ an increasingly royal style, emphasizing his noble lineage and distinguished service to the kingdom, while presenting his son Visnugupta as crown prince. These titles reveal an unmistakable ambition to portray himself as the kingdom's effective ruler, even though he continued to acknowledge the formal supremacy of the Licchavi monarch. Amsuvarman openly assumed the role of head of state toward the end of his career after rising through established offices, whereas Jisnugupta relied from the beginning upon puppet rulers whose authority existed largely in name. Even so, his political system proved remarkably stable. He governed Nepal for nearly 20 years, and after his death, his son inherited both his influence and his position without any noticeable reduction in power, demonstrating the extraordinary strength of the regime he had created. According to the Nepalese chronicles, Amsuvarman was succeeded by a ruler named Kirtivarman, inaugurating a new Thakuri dynasty. Rejects this tradition. No reliable inscription supports the existence of such a dynasty exercising sovereign authority during this period. Instead, the supposed Thakuri rulers appear either as insignificant feudatories or as later inventions introduced by chroniclers attempting to fill chronological gaps. The chronicles themselves frequently assign implausibly long reigns to little-known rulers, making their testimony on this point especially unreliable. Amsuvarman founded no lasting royal house. After his death, his descendants disappear entirely from the historical record, and none succeeded in establishing hereditary rule. The evidence supplied by inscriptions instead demonstrates that the Licchavi dynasty survived continuously throughout this period. Although powerful ministers such as Amsuvarman, Jisnugupta, and Visnugupta exercised effective control over government, they never permanently displaced the Licchavi royal line itself. The kings who occupied the throne may have possessed little real authority, but they nevertheless remained members of the legitimate dynasty. For this reason, use of the term restoration requires careful qualification. The restoration after AD 637 did not involve the return of the Licchavis to the throne, since they had technically remained there throughout the preceding decades. Rather, it marked the end of domination by powerful regents and dictators. From this point onward, Licchavi kings once again exercised direct authority instead of serving merely as ceremonial rulers controlled by ambitious ministers. Examines the circle of supporters who enabled Amsuvarman to achieve power. Although the inscriptions provide no detailed narrative of his political alliances, they preserve the names of numerous officials who witnessed royal grants. Figures such as Vrsavarma, Bhogavarma, Vipravarma Gomi, Gunachandra, Desavarma Gomi, and others probably belong to the network of influential feudatories, whose support proved essential in Amsuvarman's struggle against the Gupta rulers. Among them, Bhogavarma can be identified as Amsuvarman's nephew, while other prominent military and administrative officers remain difficult to identify with certainty. Special attention is given to Crown Prince Udayadeva. Earlier historians occasionally regarded him as Amsuvarman's son because he appears as a witness in several of Amsuvarman's inscriptions. Instead, he identifies Udayadeva as a son of King Sivadeva and therefore a genuine member of the Licchavi dynasty. His presence as a witness merely reflects his constitutional position during Amsuvarman's administration. After Amsuvarman's death, however, Udayadeva was apparently driven into exile while the throne passed to Dhruvadeva. Although Dhruvadeva formally occupied the throne, Jisnugupta exercised all effective authority. Every surviving charter of the period was issued in Jisnugupta's name from his headquarters at Kailasakuta, while the Licchavi monarch remained at Managriha as little more than a symbolic figure. Unlike Amsuvarman, whose earlier inscriptions still described him as Mahasamanta, Jisnugupta assumed supreme executive authority from the outset. Over time, his language became increasingly confident. In later documents, he even replaced the expression indicating that he acted under the king with wording placing himself alongside the sovereign, an unmistakable indication that he considered himself the ruler's equal in political authority. Yet even at the height of his power, one important distinction remained between Jisnugupta and Amsuvarman. Although he issued coins in his own name and ruled as the kingdom's undisputed master, he never adopted the title Maharaja Diraja that appears on some of Amsuvarman's coinage. Consequently, despite wielding complete executive power, Jisnugupta never claimed quite the same symbolic prestige enjoyed by his predecessor. After Dhruvadeva's death around Samvat 54, the throne passed to Bhimarjuna Deva, another Licchavi ruler who remained under Gupta domination. Jisnugupta's son Visnugupta continued exactly the same constitutional arrangement. Visnugupta himself appears first as crown prince in his father's inscriptions before assuming power, while another prince, Sridharagupta, frequently served as the royal commissioner and may have been his brother. The succession therefore demonstrates that the Gupta ministers successfully transformed what had begun as an individual dictatorship under Jisnugupta into a hereditary system of de facto rule, even while preserving the outward appearance of continuous Licchavi kingship. The chapter concludes by reconsidering the famous legend of Princess Brikuti. Although the story of her marriage to the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo has become deeply rooted in Nepalese and Tibetan tradition, argues that its historical foundations are extremely weak. The narrative originates primarily in Tibetan chronicles, which sought to magnify the prestige of Tibet by portraying their king as the husband of both a Nepalese and a Chinese princess. In later religious tradition, these queens were even transformed into manifestations of the goddess Tara, illustrating the gradual blending of mythology with historical memory. Neither Nepalese inscriptions nor contemporary Chinese records mention Brikuti at all. While the Tang annals clearly record the marriage between Songtsen Gampo and a Chinese princess, they remain silent regarding any Nepalese bride. Such silence is striking if Brikuti had truly played the extraordinary role later attributed to her. Notes that it would have been highly unusual for a princess of the proud Licchavi royal house to marry a ruler whom contemporary Indian political thought regarded as a foreign Alecha king beyond the Himalayas. The possibility that such a marriage occurred during Udayadeva's exile cannot be dismissed entirely, since political necessity sometimes overrode social convention. Nevertheless, even this modified hypothesis encounters a major difficulty. The Tang histories describe Nepal's alliance with Tibet and the restoration of the exiled king, but never mention a royal marriage that would surely have deserved notice had it actually occurred. Visnugupta's period of dominance proved far shorter than that of his father. Around AD 640 to 642, Narendra Deva returned from exile with the support of both Tibetan and Chinese allies, launching the campaign that ultimately brought Gupta rule in Nepal to an end. According to the Tang histories, this restoration marked the beginning of a new phase in Nepal's foreign relations. Through Narendra Deva, China established its first lasting diplomatic connection with Nepal, creating a route of communication that also linked the Chinese court with the Empire of Harsha in northern India. Chinese diplomatic activity quickly intensified after Narendra Deva's restoration. The envoy Li Yipiao crossed the Kerung Pass into Nepal before continuing to Harsha's court, while another mission led by Wang Xuanzhe followed a similar route in AD 646. The death of Harsha soon afterward plunged northern India into political turmoil. The Chinese embassy was attacked by a ruler identified as Arjuna, prompting Wang Xuanzhe to seek refuge in Nepal. In response, Nepal, Tibet, and China formed a military alliance that launched a successful campaign against Arjuna's forces. The Tang histories record that approximately 7,000 Nepalese soldiers joined the expedition, which ended with Arjuna's capture and deportation to China. A few years later, in AD 651, Narendra Deva's son was sent to the Chinese court bearing diplomatic gifts, further strengthening relations between the two kingdoms. Narendra Deva's reign is documented by approximately 10 surviving inscriptions extending from Samvat 69 to at least Samvat 108. Earlier, scholars mistakenly attributed several of these records to Siva Deva because of incorrect readings of their damaged dates and inscriptions. Later examination, however, established that they belonged to Narendra Deva himself. This correction significantly enhances his importance in Nepalese history, revealing a reign that was both lengthy and politically influential rather than brief or obscure. The earliest known inscription of his reign, dated Samvat 69, records a grant of land to Shaivite religious schools. Another inscription from Yanggihiti in Kathmandu, also dated Samvat 69, confirms earlier arrangements made by Bhumigupta for the maintenance of temples while praising Narendra Deva as an ornament of the Licchavi Dynasty. Significantly, he adopts the full imperial title Paramabhattaraka Maharajadiraja, the same exalted designation later employed by Sivadeva II and Jayadeva II. His decree is explicitly addressed to the future kings of Nepal, emphasizing the restoration of full royal authority after decades of domination by powerful regents. A third inscription from Patan, likewise issued from Kailasakutabhavana, grants fiscal concessions to a village by exempting it from certain state obligations, illustrating Narendra Deva's concern with administrative reform as well as religious patronage. Several additional inscriptions continue to document his long administration, including records from Deopatan, Naxal, Patan, and Chiasal. Together, they demonstrate that Narendra Deva ruled for nearly 40 years. During this period, Nepal became an active participant in diplomacy with both China and Tibet, although the Nepalese inscriptions themselves remain almost entirely silent concerning foreign embassies. While the Tang histories describe Narendra Deva as a Tibetan vassal, argues that no Nepalese evidence supports such a conclusion. Instead, his reign appears to have been remarkably stable, free from the internal conflicts that had characterized the decades preceding his restoration. Later generations remembered Narendra Deva as a powerful and victorious monarch. An inscription of Jayadeva II praises him as a ruler before whom numerous kings bowed in submission, while Nepalese chronicles associate his reign with the arrival of the revered image of Lokesvara Matsyendranath. Buddhist tradition even claims that he spent his final years in a monastery. His inscriptions likewise suggest a ruler who combined Shaivite devotion with respect for Buddhism. One displays the Dharma Chakra, the wheel of the law, flanked by two deer, while others retain traditional Shaivite and Vaishnavite symbols such as the bull and the conch and discus. This combination reflects the continuation of the religious tolerance that had characterized Amsuvarman's government. Examines the phenomenon known as the Two Sirkar rule, a political arrangement in which executive authority and royal sovereignty belong to different individuals. According to this interpretation, Nepal had long been governed through a dual structure in which the king remained the nominal sovereign, while real power rested in the hands of a regent or prime minister. The system reached its fullest development under Amsuvarman and Jisnugupta, but may have originated during the earlier Ahir-Gupta period. Although such an arrangement occasionally produced capable governments, it also encouraged rivalry between competing political centers and ultimately weakened the kingdom by inviting foreign intervention. The collapse of the system after Narendra Deva's restoration therefore marked an important turning point in Nepalese political history. The discussion then turns to Narendra Deva's successors. Certain names found in inscriptions but omitted from the chronicles have occasionally been interpreted as rulers in their own right, rejects this view. Figures such as Skandadeva and Saryadeva are more plausibly understood as crown princes who died during their father's lifetime. Consequently, no separate reigns should be inserted between Narendra Deva and Shivadeva II, whose accession is placed sometime after Samvat 109, around AD 678. Another major event followed a generation later. Chinese records report renewed Tibetan attacks upon Nepal around AD 703, culminating in a decisive Nepalese victory in AD 705. According to some accounts, the Tibetan king himself perished in the campaign. Unfortunately, neither the Chinese sources nor the Nepalese inscriptions identify the commander responsible for this triumph. Although several possible candidates have been suggested, considers Shivadeva II the most likely leader, while acknowledging that the evidence remains inconclusive. Whatever the identity of the victor, the defeat of Tibet restored Nepal's complete independence and brought an end to the period of foreign domination that had overshadowed the kingdom for decades. Attention then shifts to the chronology of Shivadeva II and Jayadeva II. Some historians argued that their inscriptions employed the harsher era, partly because Jayadeva II omitted Amsuvarman's name from his genealogy, and because Shivadeva II married a Maukari princess connected with the family of Aditya Sena. Rejects this interpretation. The inscriptional sequence remains continuous from the age of Amsuvarman through Narendra Deva, Shivadeva II, and Jayadeva II, with no interruption that would justify introducing a new chronological era. Narendra Deva's first inscription immediately follows the last records of Visnugupta, demonstrating an unbroken succession of dates. For this reason, maintains that all these inscriptions continue to employ the same era established earlier, whose epoch he places around AD 568 rather than the harsher era beginning in AD 606 to 607. The surviving inscriptions of Shivadeva II and Jayadeva II illustrate the renewed confidence of the restored Licchavi monarchy. Issued primarily from Kailasa Kutabhavana, they continue the administrative traditions established under Amsuvarman while preserving increasingly elaborate royal titles. Among them, the inscription of Jayadeva II occupies a particularly important place because it presents the genealogy of the Licchavi Dynasty. Beginning with Supuspa of Pataliputra and tracing the succession through Vrasadeva, Shankaradeva, Dharmadeva, Manadeva, Mahideva, and Vasantadeva, it eventually reaches Udayadeva, Narendra Deva, Shivadeva, and finally Jayadeva himself. The inscription also records important dynastic marriages linking the Nepalese royal family with the Maukari rulers of Magadha and the kings of Gauda, demonstrating the close political and cultural ties that connected Nepal with the major kingdoms of northern India. The restoration of direct Licchavi rule ushered in one of the most prosperous periods in early Nepalese history. Political stability returned after decades of internal rivalry and foreign interference, while the abolition of the dual system of government strengthened royal authority. The restored kings deliberately preserved many of Amsuvarman's administrative and cultural reforms instead of attempting to erase his legacy. Although personally devoted to Shaivism, they continued to extend protection and patronage to Buddhist monasteries, maintaining the religious tolerance that had become a defining feature of Nepalese society. Economic recovery was equally impressive. Agriculture, irrigation, commerce, and long-distance trade revived rapidly, while diplomatic marriages and commercial relations with Magadha, Gauda, and other neighboring states reinforced Nepal's integration into the wider political and cultural world of northern India. Some historians have argued that Nepal remained under Tibetan domination throughout this period. Firmly rejects this interpretation. Following the major Nepalese victory over Tibet in AD 705, Tibet itself became increasingly weakened by internal conflict and external pressures. Its military setbacks eventually culminated in defeats at the hands of Kashmir during the later 8th century. Far from being capable of dominating Nepal, Tibet was struggling to preserve its own position. Nepal, by contrast, emerged from these years stronger than before, successfully defending its independence while consolidating its authority throughout the Himalayan region. To reinforce this argument turns to the celebrated narrative preserved in Kalhana's Rajatarangini. According to this account, the ambitious Kashmiri king Jayapida embarked upon a series of conquests across northern India before eventually encountering the ruler of Nepal. Rather than submitting, the Nepalese king skillfully drew the invader deep into difficult terrain before forcing him into battle along the banks of the Kali Gandaki River. There, Jayapida suffered a disastrous defeat, was taken prisoner, and regained his freedom only after paying a heavy ransom and acknowledging the superiority of his victorious opponent. Argues that the geographical details supplied by Kalhana strongly support the historicity of this encounter. The battlefield is clearly located on the Kali Gandaki River in western Nepal, particularly in the region around present-day Ridi. Such precise topographical references make it highly unlikely that Kalhana confused Nepal with Tibet, as some modern scholars have proposed. Since the Kashmiri historian repeatedly praised Nepalese courage elsewhere in his work, there is little reason to believe that he mistakenly attributed a Tibetan victory to Nepal. Kalhana's dramatic description portrays Jayapetra confidently advancing across what appeared to be a shallow river. Once his army had entered the stream, however, the waters suddenly rose, trapping men, horses, and elephants alike. While confusion spread among the invaders, the Nepalese forces launched their attack. Jayapetra was swept away by the current, captured alive, and held under close guard after being rescued from the river. Negotiations eventually secured his release, but only after he agreed to terms imposed by the Nepalese ruler. The episode is presented as one of the greatest military triumphs in early Nepalese history. A major historical problem nevertheless remains: the identity of the victorious ruler whom Kalhana calls Aramudi. No Nepalese inscription or chronicle mentions such a king, despite the remarkable nature of his achievement. Does not believe this silence is sufficient reason to reject Kalhana's account. Given Kalhana's reputation as a careful historian, it is improbable that he invented the defeat of a Kashmiri monarch by a foreign ruler. Instead, the disappearance of Aramudi from Nepalese tradition may simply reflect the fragmentary survival of historical records from this period. One possible explanation is that Aramudi belonged to the Gandak region itself rather than to the Kathmandu Valley. The battle took place in territory traditionally inhabited by the Magas, an Indo-Mongolian people whose homeland stretched across the upper Gandaki Basin. This region had long served as an important center of settlement and culture, yet its early history remains poorly understood. Archaeological exploration may eventually reveal political institutions far more sophisticated than those currently known. Therefore entertains the possibility that Aramudi was an independent Magar ruler controlling much of western Nepal. At the time of Jayapetra's invasion, the authority of the Licchavi Dynasty had weakened considerably. Under such circumstances, regional kingdoms may well have emerged in the western Himalayas. If Aramudi governed one of these states, his dominion might have extended across much of the Gandaki Basin and perhaps even farther west toward the Kali River. Over the centuries that followed, however, both the kingdom and its dynasty could easily have disappeared from historical memory, leaving Kalhana's account as the only surviving testimony to their existence. Following Jayadeva II, the historical record becomes dramatically poorer. Although the Licchavi dynasty almost certainly continued to rule, no securely dated inscriptions survive for approximately 2.5 centuries after Jayadeva's final inscription. This absence of documentary evidence makes it impossible to reconstruct a continuous political narrative for the period extending into the early 11th century. To bridge this gap turns to numismatic evidence. Bronze coins bearing the inscription Sri Pashupati provide the strongest indication that the Licchavi monarchy continued beyond Jayadeva II. Earlier scholars often assign these coins to much earlier rulers on the basis of paleography, argues that both their artistic style and their historical context place them firmly in the 8th century. Their Shaivite symbolism also corresponds much more closely to the known religious affiliations of the later Licchavi kings than to those of earlier generations. These coins therefore support the conclusion that the Licchavi dynasty retained both its authority and its prestige after Jayadeva II. Rather than indicating the appearance of an entirely new ruling house, the numismatic evidence suggests continuity. The coins belong to Shivadeva II, Jayadeva II, and their immediate successors, while additional varieties probably represent rulers who followed them. Together they indicate that the Licchavi monarchy preserved its royal status, political legitimacy, and public prestige well beyond the period illuminated by surviving inscriptions, even though written records from these later centuries have largely disappeared. The Chinese records of the Tang dynasty provide one of the richest surviving descriptions of Nepal during the 7th century. Although the account was compiled in connection with events around AD 646, argues that its observations accurately reflect the political and social conditions that prevailed throughout much of the 7th and 8th centuries. For that reason, these records offer an invaluable picture not merely of a single moment, but of an entire historical era, including the administrative traditions established under Amsuvarman and maintained by his successors. Among the most remarkable features noted by the Chinese envoys were Nepal's sacred natural sites. They describe a mysterious spring whose waters could apparently burn with flames that intensified when water was poured upon them. Local tradition explained the phenomenon by claiming that the submerged crown of the future Buddha, Maitreya, rested beneath the lake, protected by a powerful fire naga. Nearby stood another celebrated shrine surrounded by forests and temples, where tame fish and dragons were believed to approach visitors peacefully, while anyone who harmed them invited both personal disaster and the destruction of the sanctuary itself. These descriptions reveal how deeply natural landscapes, religious belief, and local legend were intertwined in the spiritual life of early medieval Nepal. The Tang account also remarks that Nepal had recently come under Tibetan influence, yet cautions against interpreting this statement as evidence of permanent subjugation. Instead, he views it as a temporary political condition connected with Narendra Deva's restoration rather than a lasting loss of sovereignty. More significant than this brief reference is the Chinese admiration for Nepal's remarkable architectural achievements, particularly an enormous multi-storied palace whose dazzling decorations of stone, pearls, and precious ornaments left a lasting impression on foreign visitors. The Chinese observers also recorded numerous details about everyday Nepalese life. Men wore their hair cut to eyebrow level and adorned elongated ears with bamboo or horn ornaments regarded as marks of beauty. Meals were eaten by hand rather than with utensils, while copper served as the principal material for household objects and coinage. Wooden houses were elaborately carved and painted, theatrical performances were popular, and music accompanied public celebrations. The visitors further noted the Nepalese interest in astrology, mathematics, calendar making, and natural philosophy, suggesting a society in which scientific learning occupied a respected place alongside religious devotion. The account offers a vivid description of King Narendra Deva himself. Adorned with pearls, crystal, coral, amber, gold, and jade, he sat upon a lion throne within a richly decorated audience hall where flowers and incense filled the air. Courtiers occupied positions on either side, while armed guards surrounded the royal seat. At the heart of the palace rose a magnificent 7-story tower covered with copper tiles and embellished with precious stones. From its summit, water flowed through elaborate copper pipes fashioned into dragons and mythical Makara creatures, creating fountains that combined engineering skill with artistic imagination. The Chinese historians also summarized Narendra Deva's political career. They state that his father had been deposed by a younger brother, forcing the prince into hiding before he found refuge in Tibet. Tibetan assistance later enabled him to reclaim the throne, after which Nepal cooperated closely with both Tibet and China. When the Chinese envoy Wang Xuanzhe was attacked in India, Nepal dispatched cavalry to assist the expedition, contributing to the successful defeat of the hostile forces. Diplomatic relations remained cordial thereafter, and in AD 651, Narendra Deva sent an official embassy bearing tribute and gifts to the Tang court. However, the greatest significance of the Tang narrative lies in its economic observations. Chinese visitors were struck by Nepal's thriving commercial life, describing merchants as abundant while farmers appeared comparatively few. Geography largely explains this pattern. Mountainous terrain limited agricultural expansion, encouraging Nepal instead to develop as a commercial intermediary linking Tibet with the plains of India. The country exported grain, fruit, copper, and products derived from yak herds while serving as an essential transit center through which goods moved between the Himalayan plateau and South Asia. Caravans carried merchandise to markets in both directions, making commerce one of the principal foundations of Nepal's prosperity. Industrial production reflected the kingdom's natural resources. Copper was plentiful and widely employed for tools, utensils, architecture, and coinage, whereas silver remained comparatively scarce. Even so, silver currency circulated in limited quantities to facilitate increasingly sophisticated commercial transactions. Sees these monetary practices as evidence of a mature economy capable of supporting extensive internal and international trade. The Tang historians also present a much more favorable picture of the Nepalese people than that offered by Xuanzang. Whereas Xuanzang criticized their appearance and manners, the Tang account praises their physical bearing, intelligence, and scientific accomplishments. believes these conflicting descriptions probably arose from Xuanzang's personal prejudices against the ritualistic forms of Buddhism practiced in Nepal, or from his first encounters with communities living in the Terai rather than with the population of the Kathmandu Valley itself. In contrast, the later Chinese record depicts a cultured and intellectually accomplished society whose achievements in astronomy, science, and learning impressed foreign observers. One of the most significant discussions concerns architecture. The palace described by the Chinese sources corresponds closely to the multi-tiered wooden structures now associated with the Nepalese pagoda tradition. Argues that this architectural style did not originate in China, as many earlier scholars believed. Since Chinese records indicate that no comparable buildings existed there before the mid-7th century, he proposes instead that the style developed in Nepal before spreading to Tibet and eventually farther across Asia. Rich carvings, painted walls, decorative facades, and carefully planned temple complexes made Nepal one of the foremost artistic centers of the Himalayan world. Although many of these monuments have since disappeared, inscriptions testify to the extensive royal patronage that supported their construction and maintenance. Nepal's influence extended far beyond architecture. During Narendra Deva's reign, the kingdom became one of the principal transmitters of Indian civilization into Tibet. Nepalese scholars, working alongside colleagues from Kashmir, helped refine the Tibetan language and introduce the Gupta and later Lansa scripts that became central to Tibetan literary culture. They also played a decisive role in establishing Mahayana Buddhism within Tibet centuries before the better-known missions of Shantarakshita and Padmasambhava. Religious teachers such as Sila Manjusri and Buddha Kirti, together with numerous artists and craftsmen, transformed Tibetan religious and artistic life. Argues that Nepal's contribution to the Tibetan cultural renaissance was comparable to the role Magadha had earlier played in spreading Indian civilization to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. The opening of the Banepa to Kuti route around AD 639 fundamentally reshaped communication across the Himalayas. Before this route became available, travelers moving between India and China were forced to follow long and hazardous roads through Central Asia. The new Himalayan corridor dramatically shortened the journey and soon became the principal highway for merchants, monks, scholars, and diplomatic missions. As Chinese pilgrims increasingly passed through Nepal, the kingdom assumed an even greater importance as the cultural bridge linking India, Tibet, and East Asia. Turning to political institutions, argues that Nepal's monarchy reflected broader developments already visible in the Gupta Empire. Earlier, Indian kings had traditionally governed with the participation of assemblies and councils, but by the 6th and 7th centuries, power had become increasingly concentrated in the hands of hereditary rulers. Nepal followed this pattern. At the apex of government stood the Maharaja, or, during periods of regency, a ruler such as Amsuvarman. Supporting him was a complex administrative hierarchy that included commanders of the army, chief judicial and ceremonial officers, ministers responsible for religion, provincial governors known as samantas, and numerous royal officials charged with taxation, justice, diplomacy, and local administration. Despite this movement towards centralized authority, emphasizes that Nepalese kings rarely exercised unlimited despotism. Amsuvarman in particular governed with unusual moderation, frequently consulting respected elders, protecting ordinary people from arbitrary interference by officials, and presenting himself as the guardian rather than the master of his subjects. His successors gradually restored stronger royal authority, yet they largely preserved the principles of responsible government that he had established. Village communities retained important forms of self-government through local assemblies, while large religious endowments, known as agraharas, enjoyed broad autonomy, serving not only as centers of worship but also as institutions devoted to scholarship and higher learning. Economic policy under Amsuvarman reflected the same concern for public welfare. Monetary reforms introduced standardized copper and silver currency, strengthening commercial exchange and reinforcing Nepal's role as the chief intermediary between Tibet and India. At the same time, the government invested heavily in irrigation by constructing and carefully regulating extensive canal systems. Water distribution was supervised through village committees, while maintenance costs were financed by dedicated irrigation taxes. Additional revenue came from agricultural produce, defense levies, customs duties, taxes on luxury goods, fisheries, forests, markets, and certain commercial activities. Even compulsory labor obligations were regulated, with some communities permitted to commute their service into monetary payments. Far from representing arbitrary exactions, these measures reveal an organized fiscal administration supporting agriculture, commerce, infrastructure, and public institutions throughout the kingdom. The surviving inscriptions and Chinese accounts together portray a prosperous and sophisticated society. Agriculture benefited from irrigation and careful land management, while trade flourished along routes linking India and Tibet. Artisans produced fine metalwork, jewelry, sculpture, architecture, and religious images admired by foreign visitors. Caravans crossed the Himalayan passes, carrying goods in both directions, and merchants organized themselves under experienced caravan leaders. A developed monetary economy, based primarily on copper coinage but supplemented by silver denominations, facilitated these exchanges. Although many details remain uncertain, the combined evidence leaves little doubt that 7th and 8th century Nepal possessed a remarkably advanced political organization, vibrant economy, and rich cultural life that placed it among the leading Himalayan civilizations of its age.